Committee will call this meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Senator French,
Here.
Senator Hicks,
Here.
Senator Ide,
Here.
Senator Cole,
Present.
Senator Larson,
Here.
Representative Allemande,
Present.
Representative Allred,
Here.
Representative Banks,
Here.
Representative Conrad,
Oh, excuse.
Representative
Sorry.
Frago,
Here.
Representative Davis,
Here.
Representative Slagle,
Present.
Representative Winter,
Here.
Co-Chairman Steinmetz. Here. Chairman Eklund.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Okay, we're going to have a few words from the college president, Mr. Haas. Oh, Hans is here. Well, wait a minute here. Mr. President, I'll kind of give you the floor right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairman, for just providing me one quick minute here to provide again a continued welcome here on the Torrington campus for Eastern Wyoming College. Yesterday, we had an opportunity with our good partners here locally, Goshen Economic Development, who sponsored our luncheon in the ATEC Center, to tour what we consider a significant investment from our community. Yesterday, our good mayor had an opportunity to highlight the significance of agriculture to our local community. And that facility that we toured, again, occupies 24,000 square feet, was constructed at a cost of $8.2 million. And that facility is a testament to the self-sustainability that we desire to achieve in our community. That particular project was erected entirely with the assistance, without the assistance of state funds. Instead, that project was financed really through a cooperative partnership through the Economic Development Administration grant, contributions from Eastern Wyoming College Foundation. And what we know was one of the most significant parts was a vigorous private fundraising effort working with our local partners and our local stakeholders in our region. That building now provides critical infrastructure to drive what we are planning on continuing to support at a very high level, a competitive judging and show teams that we know help draw talent and students that will choose our college to as a place to start preparing for their future, thinking about their role in agriculture. Soon, Eastern Wyoming College will be known for a state-of-the-art precision agriculture program. EWC is partnering with our neighboring county, right on the edge of our county here in Goshen County, the Sustainable Agricultural Research Center, or short term for SARIC, which is a research center for the University of Wyoming. We are investing heavily as a college, and so is the state, through a strategic investment from the governor's office via the Wyoming Innovation Partnership. That initiative promises to introduce our students to the latest technologies, advancements, research practices that we know the agricultural sector has not only embedded, but helping ensure that we have market leading technologies that we're training our students in, with the goal to the program will encompass internships and integrations with our industry and local ag partners to make sure that we're a viable part of preparing that future workforce that will be entering that industry. We're confident that the precision ag program associated not only with the University of Wyoming, but looking at other things that we can invest in. We bring students not only from the state of Wyoming, but across the country. And as I had mentioned to this group, even in the tour, I had a prior stint at a college that drew 350 agriculture students. Half of those students were in state and half of those students were neighboring states. As far as out west here in the state of Wyoming, we drew students right here out of Torrington when I was located there. And again, one of my goals is to reverse that trend, keep those students and talent within our local region and create us, put us in as one of the centers of excellence of what our agricultural programming can deliver. And so again, the work that you do representing not only your communities and your state is vitally important. And I trust that as we continue to move forward, we'll be able to have some shared partnerships that will be significant, not only for EWC and the communities that we serve, but for the agricultural sector as well. So thank you again for hosting your sessions on our campus, and good luck in the rest of your mission today.
Thank you, Mr. President. Something I would just like to comment on. So I represent Eastern Laramie County, and I was born and raised as a neighbor to Torrington here. And I have family and friends, a lot of them, that have gone to school down here, and I've never heard a negative comment from any of the people who went to college here. And I've heard similar testimonies, but I think that's a testimony to a great education and a good job done by your college and others. I've heard kind of the same story, even the university, that you think you're going to hear a lot of negative stuff, but every time we pay for funding to fund what's constitutional, which is a university, and the junior colleges fall under that somewhat. When we pay for those things, I think of the affordable and good education that students are getting in Wyoming. Thank you for your part in it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have one of my former classmates, Hans. How are you doing? Hans Hunt from Newcastle area. And you still work for Cynthia. Did you want to say anything while you're here?
Just generally, no, thank you. I just thought I was in the area this week, going over the top of the tomorrow, but just came by to sit in on the meetings in the morning and see what you all are looking at. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good to see you. I guess one more little house cleaning deal. It was called to our attention that the BLM is imposing some new rules that'll be like the last set of rules they tried to impose, called conservation use. They'd be just a very vague set of rules that would probably damage the grazers in our BLM system. And Chairman Steinmetz and I have agreed to sign on to a letter objecting to these rules. We believe they'd be damaging to Wyoming, and if without objection from the committee, we'd do that. I see no objection, so thank you. I think we'll go right into our first item of discussion. That'd be meat processing. We have okay, Donna Shippen from our LSO will be online. Donna, are you ready? Go when you're ready.
Yes, I am. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, I'm going to present the research memo that LSO was asked to prepare for the committee on how Wyoming and surrounding states regulate animal mortality, waste, composting, and land application. You should have this in your meeting materials. The pages 1 through 3 summarize how Wyoming regulates animal mortality waste. Under the Solid Waste Management Act, animal mortality waste is considered municipal solid waste. The Department of Environmental Quality produced a solid waste guideline, guideline number 27 in July 2022, that gave options for the disposal of animal mortality waste, and those options are listed on page 2. So animal mortality waste may be disposed of at a municipal solid waste facility or a waste transfer station. It may be composted at a construction and demolition facility, or composted at a low hazard, low volume facility if the compost area is no larger than 2 acres, or for larger compost operations, the animal mortality waste can be composted at a full-sized transfer, treatment, and storage facility. There are a couple of exceptions to the permitting requirements for compost facilities, and those are also listed on page 2. So if an individual farming or ranching operation wishes to dispose or compost of their own dead animals that are, just generated incidental to the farming or ranching operation, they can do that without needing a composting or disposal or a solid waste permit from DEQ. Or if it's a small, what's called a de minimis composting operation that covers an area no larger than 1 acre or composts no more than 50 animals at any given time, the operation does not have to seek a permit, a solid waste compost or a solid waste disposal permit from DEQ. And then the additional options for disposing of animal mortality waste are it can be incinerated at a permitted incineration facility, or it can be rendered. According to guideline number 27, there currently are no rendering facilities in Wyoming, but there are out-of-state rendering companies that serve feedlots in the state. Back in, on page 3 of the research memo right now, back in March of 2006, the DEQ Solid Waste Division and the Department of Agriculture issued some guidance, it's guideline number 17, on how to compost animal mortality waste. It provides some general guidelines about composting, and also provides possible uses for the finished compost. The 2 uses listed are to use the finished compost as an amendment for additional composting operations, so kind of a starter mix for additional composting, or the finished compost can be applied as a soil amendment for to the land. The DEQ doesn't provided these guidelines for composting and land application, but doesn't regulate those activities. And I'll get into that a little bit more in just a minute. On page 3 of the memo, it also talks about some composting seminars that DEQ has been offering this spring around the state to educate people about composting of animal mortality waste. Starting on page 4 of the memo, there's information about how surrounding states regulate the disposal and composting of animal mortality waste. Most states surrounding Wyoming provide more regulatory oversight of composting and land application than Wyoming does. I should say that one state, Utah, does not allow composting of animal mortality waste, but all the other surrounding states do. Colorado, Idaho, and Montana require that composting operations submit design and/or operation plans to their state departments of environmental quality for approval. Montana has an additional requirement that composting operations perform regular sampling and report those results to their state environmental quality department. North Dakota and South Dakota do not have permitting requirements for compost operations, but if the operation wants to apply the finished compost as fertilizer or as a soil amendment, they must submit a nutrient management plan to their state Department of Environmental Quality for approval. So Wyoming and Nebraska are the only states that don't require submission of a compost design or operation plan prior to composting the waste, or submission of a nutrient management plan for approval prior to applying the finished compost as fertilizer or a soil amendment. There's an appendix to the research memo, Appendix A, and it's a table that summarizes Wyoming and the other surrounding state regulations regarding composting and land application. I just want to add that and this is not included in the memo. The memo just focuses on how the Department of Environmental Quality regulates animal mortality waste as solid waste. If a composting operation wants to distribute their finished compost as commercial fertilizer or a soil amendment, that falls under a different Wyoming law that's not covered in this memo. That would fall under the Wyoming fertilizer law that regulates commercial fertilizers. And under that law, if you wanted to sell the finished compost, you would have to register the product with the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture, not DEQ, regulates commercial fertilizer. So there are some, you would have to register the product, and there's some labeling requirements. And I believe the Department of Agriculture is there at your meeting in Torrington and is going to talk a little bit more about the fertilizer law and regulations. So that's all I have. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Committee questions?
Go ahead.
Oh, Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Shippen, I was just curious, did you do any research in comparison of our state regs to the federal regs or just surrounding states?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Craigo, I just looked at state regulations. I didn't look at federal regulations.
Okay, other questions? Senator Hicks. Oh, go ahead, Larry.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Shippen, the question I have is this memo focuses a lot on what the other states do regarding composting. But yet when I read through the memo, there's a number of areas, so Nebraska, for example, that they're not aware of any Nebraska meat processing facilities that compost animal mortality waste. Obviously, there's other methodologies, and it talks about that even under our regulations as far as burial facilities and stuff. But when you put this together, did you look specifically at those other states' regulatory issues associated with what we would normally call dead animal pits or burial at landfills?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, my research showed that all the surrounding states like Wyoming allow for burial of animal mortality waste at landfills, but the individual landfills can choose to accept or not accept that waste. And if you're disposing of waste at a landfill, you fall under their regulatory requirements. So that municipal in Wyoming, and I believe this is true in all the surrounding states, those municipal landfills do have to be permitted by their state environmental quality agencies, and they fall under the state solid waste laws and regulations. But I believe the landfills also, have the power to accept or not accept the waste, waste that they choose to accept.
So
I hope that answers your question.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the simple fact is the cheapest and most efficient way to dispose of this is just through burial at a landfill, assuming that we don't get into overzealous regulation with requiring leachate collection systems and transfer of the leachate and all of that stuff. It seems to me that we're going to spend an inordinate amount of time on composting when we should be looking at the opportunity for the permitting of dead animal pit or disposal facilities, either at private facilities or even at existing municipal permitted facilities, and take a hard look at that and see what we regulatory wise, how we do, what are the impediments to doing that? through the permitting process with the department, look at maybe private facilities to set these type of things up for. So just think of the lagoon we saw yesterday and the implications and the cost associated with that versus just a simple pit that you would bury a little dirt back every day. And so I'm just cognizant of the costs and the permitting time to do this, but I think we should explore this and see what some of the other states are doing associated with that. And even within our own state regulations associated with just burial pits, both at existing permitted facility, regulatory compliance, and the possibility of a individual permit for those facilities for that to occur. So Dawn, I guess, and Mr. Chairman, the question would be to continue your work on this line, but take a much more detailed look at the burial and permitting from other states for offal and animal waste.
Okay, permitting, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, if I can just clarify.
Yeah, so what are the permit requirements for their, what we would normally call dead animal pits or burial pits in the other states? And my guess is we're going to see a variation. Again, I think one of the reasons that we've seen some of these being reduced is some of the onerous regulatory environments associated with those facilities. But I think this committee needs to understand the nature of that and what those opportunities are, because by far it is the cheapest method to dispose of the waste from these processing facilities.
Yeah, and so Senator Hicks, I think we have some of those methods of composting and disposal from other states, and we could have part of the conversation today. Comment I'd make on the cheapest way is getting it to the landfill. I think everybody should pencil out that it's 6 cents a pound and tons and tons of offal being hauled off from our meat processors. There isn't a very cheap option for them right now. And in some cases, if that were removed, the landfill option, and they could do that, they'd have no place to go with it. And I'd hate to see a new company shut down because we don't have options. So we'll discuss the possibility of private composting facilities.
Mr. Chairman, just for clarification, I'm not interested in private composting facilities. I'm interested in a permit for a private individual to do a burial pit.
Okay.
So, because with the composting, as we get into this, I think we'll see there's other issues that are potentially out there that.
Sure.
But that's primarily where I would like to see us, staff do a little more research on that issue.
Okay. Representative Davis.
Mr. Chairman, the other thing that we don't seem to be considering here is the wildlife that is processed in Wyoming at these facilities. Where do they follow in on this? Here we're talking about agricultural needs, but all our hunters that come in here to the state and they hunt and they take their animal down to the local processing plant. Where does that waste fall in?
So Donna, can you help us with that?
Mr. Chairman, this memo just looks generally at animal mortality waste, and I think it would include both waste from domestic animal slaughter and wild animal processing.
Okay. Well, we might have some help from the DEQ on that question when they come up. Chairman Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Donna, just following up on what Senator Hicks was talking about, I think on page 2, under DEQ authorized animal mortality waste disposal options. If you're ranching, under the first bullet point under that, it looks like lands and facilities owned by a person engaged in farming or ranching and used to dispose of solid waste generated incidental to the farming and ranching operation. I think he's talking about, they have a pit on their land that they're, or whatever, however they choose to handle dead carcasses. Sometimes it's a cow in a bog and you can't get them out, but that aside, I think that might be kind of where we're headed. And then I guess my question too would be, and it might be for the Department of Ag when we get there, we've talked about a lot of commercial application, but we dispose of manure as a fertilizer. It's not really regulated. There's lots of things that could be in manure, and it's broadcast all over our fields and used to help the soil profile. And we know that it does. And so I guess I'd like to know why. I know that there's some diseases and things like that. However, especially in a USDA plant, the lymph nodes and the animal is inspected for disease at those plants. And so if we don't have a diseased animal, if it is appropriate for human consumption, it should be appropriate to be spread as fertilizer. I mean, just a little bit of a common sense approach. So I don't know if we can, that was two things rolled into one. If we can look into that further, or maybe other commenters will have some information for us on that today.
Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Steinmetz, just to reply, yes, burial pits are permitted on private, individual farms and ranches to deal with their animal mortality waste. I know the DEQ is there, and I hope when they present, they'll correct me if I'm wrong. However, I think if a commercial operation were wanting to create a dead animal permit, it would probably have to be a permitted solid waste facility. And again, I hope DEQ will correct me if I'm wrong. And then as far as my understanding, as far as the spreading of finished compost from animal mortality waste, if you're spreading it on your own land, I don't believe there's any requirement to register that finished compost as fertilizer. It's only if you want to distribute that finished compost commercially, if you want to sell it or make it available to others. Then under Wyoming's fertilizer law, which is administered by the Department of Agriculture, you would have to register that fertilizer or soil amendment with the Department of Agriculture before you could distribute it for land application. So I hope that answers your questions.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions for Mrs. Shippen? Okay, thank you. So next on our agenda will be the Department of Ag. Director Miyamoto couldn't be here, but he sent Julie Cook, his one of his helpers, to discuss things with us. And
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee. Excuse me, my name is Julie Cook. I'm the administrative manager for the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. With me is Ashley Stegman. She's the assistant manager of consumer health services. As the chairman said, Director Miyamoto sends his regrets for not being able to be here today. He is out of state on a previously scheduled meeting. So he asked me and Ashley to explain the WDA grant extension program that was run. If you're ready with that. You all should have a handout that we prepared that talks about the Wyoming Meat Process Expansion Program grants. The director is very proud of these programs and the positive impact that they had on this industry. On the first slide, it details that the program was created under the special session rules using CARES Act funding. We at the Department of Agriculture developed a 50-50 cost share program on a reimbursable basis. We were able to create emergency rules and an online application process within a 2-week period of the program announcement. Our program began in September 15th of 2020. Both of our programs, the applications were reviewed by staff from the Governor's Office, the Wyoming Department of Agriculture, and the Wyoming Business Council. On the next slide, we'll discuss the first round of meat expansion program grants. The original allocation from the Governor's Office was $10 million, but due to the really short time frame that we had with the timeframe put on CARES Act funding, a half of that was returned to the Governor's Office for reallocation throughout the state. The dates of our program, as I said, were September of 2020, which is when the program was announced, through December 30 of 2022. Eligible improvement expenses were allocated back to April 1st, 2020, when the pandemic was first declared. And it did have to end on December 30, 2020, based on the CARES Act funding requirements at that time when we were actually running the program. We received 52 applications. 42 of those applications were approved at the amount of a little over $4.9 million. Funds dispersed to grantees were just about $3.4 million. And then I also listed on that slide for you to see all the different locations where meat processors were that received grant funding for this. So it hit a large variety of places in the state of Wyoming. The next one, you'll recall that we did a second grant expansion program. And this time the department was allocated $2 million. This one ran from July of 2021 through December 15th of 2021. The expenses, however, were allowed to go back to April 1 of 2020. For the second round of these applications, we received 41, of which 20 were approved, and we actually dispersed funds of $1.85 million. I did want to note that we did approve grants of 1.9 million. And then the locations of those grants are also detailed there. It is really one of the things that we wanted to point out is that we had quite a few challenges for these programs, which we'll discuss on a following slide. But the director was very proud of the amount of work and money that got out on the ground in such short order for all of these. The next slide, one of the things that we were asked to talk about was, did we see any increased production in meat processing within the state of Wyoming during these? So I'm going to have Ashley, if that's all right, Mr. Chairman, review the next two slides with you to kind of goes over the different production that we had from pre and after.
Thank you, Julie. Go ahead, Ashley, when you're ready.
Chairman Eklund and committee, the slide that you see in front of you regarding the facilities and production numbers for the first meat processing and expansion grant that was issued in 2020. Those funds were awarded to various different facilities, whether it's a custom exempt facility, a state inspected facility, or a federal USDA inspected facility. At the beginning of 2020, the federal facilities within Wyoming included 3. By the end of 2020, that grew to 5. Along with our increased volume of production and heads slaughtered, 7,100 heads slaughtered throughout the state of Wyoming within these different facilities, a total of 5.9 million pounds. And then we also have to communicate that our custom exempt facilities also produce a lot of poundage, but unfortunately that is not comprised in our USDA livestock slaughter annual report. And so our custom exempt facilities are those individuals that work directly with the rancher or owner. The following slide, you'll see similar to the information, but you can see our numbers have increased. We had brought on a few more custom facilities, and we also saw some custom facilities move up to federal facilities. Within 2020, as I said, we had 3 federal facilities. At the end of 2020, there were 5. And at the end of 2022, we saw that grow to 12. Now, a few of our state inspected facilities did move up into the federal facility line. And so we are still holding currently with 9 state inspected facilities throughout the state. We had a total head slaughter of 12,700 for the year of 2022. Previous to 2020, that was 7,100 head slaughtered. And our increase for pounds produced is 10.2 million pounds. That is an increase from 5.9 million pounds 2 years prior. So with the inclusion and the funds available, we definitely did see an increase in our facilities and the pounds produced here in Wyoming. That equivalates to about a 42% increase of pounds of product produced right here in Wyoming.
Our final slide, Mr. Chairman, just goes over some of the challenges that were encountered that we wanted to bring to your attention. It was important to note that the short grant cycles that were required associated with the CARES Act funding, as well as the necessary dollars. As I said, this was a 50-50 reimbursable grant. And so the processor had to come up with half of the cost and the grant program paid for the other half of the cost. And so some of those facilities did not necessarily have the dollars available to do their portion of that. There was also a lot of supply chain demands at the time. And we still see that today, but that was just people getting equipment in and in place in time for them to be able to be reimbursed for those expenses. There's also been limitations of available workforce, which we think is important to note as well. And we were also, meat plants are also competing to complete improvements with competing demands for service. So it may be hard to get an electrician into a meat plant when you also need him at somewhere else to go as well. And so we wanted to point out some of the challenges that we saw that were encountered during this program and that were relayed to us from different meat programs that we're trying to work within our program requirements. And if you have any questions, Mr. Chairman, we'd be happy to answer those on this portion of our presentation.
Committee questions for Department of Ag? I guess I would have one. Do we have any mechanism in place to review with all the new plants? And we talked with toward 2 plants, and they've had, let's see, one was a January and February time frame when business was a little sparse. Do we have any way of, I don't know if you talk to these processors on a regular basis, can find out if we need to know when we're saturated. And the reason I say that is if we continue to build these things and then there's no business, they're really, I don't know what they cost, but they've got to cost a lot of money. We saw them, they're stellar facilities and I know it's CARES funding and we're probably okay there, but when we start granting money out of our own pockets and as well as theirs, especially the little businesses that start up, we need an idea of when to stop. And I'm wondering if the Department of Ag has talked about that or considered it.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have talked about that. One of the things the director and I discussed as I was preparing for this presentation was oversaturation in the market. And that was one of his concerns, is he wants to make sure that in his mind, we haven't been able to stabilize the market yet to figure out what our real demand is. And so he and I talked about that he doesn't want to see the oversaturation. He doesn't want to see us putting more money into this and then putting someone else out of business due to that saturation of the market. So he believes that we need additional time to kind of see a stabilization of the market, to see from both the perspective of animals needing slaughter as well as supply chain out to different areas who's buying the product out. And so that was a concern of his, and he does think we need a little bit of time to see that stabilization.
Okay, well, Bob, did you have Representative or Senator Ide? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you explain, we heard a little bit of it yesterday, but would you explain why somebody would choose, a custom exempt facility versus a state facility versus a federal facility? What are sort of the, parameters of why you have a lot more custom exempt versus state and federal? Could you explain that? Thank you.
Chairman and Senator Ide, our difference between our custom exempt facilities and our state inspected facilities range in various matters, but basically on a custom exempt, they're working with the owner, the rancher. That meat from that animal is going to be going directly back to that owner. And there's not as much required there. We don't have a regular inspector assigned to that facility to review slaughter practices. Depending on their processes, they don't have to have a HACCP plan to the same degree as, say, a state inspected facility does. When you get into a federal facility, you have an assigned inspector there through slaughter and processing. The same thing occurs in our state inspected facilities, but that is not occurring within our custom exempt facilities. That product is presumably going back to the owner. It's not going out to consumer base where it can be purchased off the store shelf.
Senator, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask for you to expand on the conversation that you just started that I heard about oversaturation of the market. What exactly is your intent or the outcome of a conversation that you're making a value judgment on businesses? And frankly, it sounds like picking winners or losers eventually, because oversaturation leads only to one end, is deciding what do you do next. So just what is the thought process there with the department? And we're, inevitably, the scenario is you've decided that there is too many folks out there doing the same thing and there's just not enough business. Is that anything to do with what you're talking about, or no?
Mr. Chairman, no. I mean, what our concern is we don't want to set people up for failure. We believe this program was very much needed. It has provided a great impact to the state of Wyoming, but we also don't know, we don't have any funds to give meat programs. We had these two meat programs, processing plant grant expansions, but he was just concerned that a lot of people feel it's a very lucrative business. And if they want to go into that, that's fine. And that we encourage that. In fact, we encourage people to look at federal plant development, because we feel that expands the horizons of their ability to sell different products across state lines. And we feel that's very important. And that's the direction that the department has encourage people to go if they feel that that's where they want to go with the production of meat. We're in no way saying that we don't think more plants are necessary. We just think that stabilization to see the progress and where that's going is. So if you're looking to create a new program, that was just a thought that he had. Does that answer your question, Mr. Chairman?
Senator Kolb.
Yeah, follow up. It does. I just needed clarification on what you meant by what you said, because it just kind of came out of nowhere. But once again, I think this is anecdotal. Let businesses sort it out. Okay. Government's never very good at picking winners and losers. So I just hope you'd always look at that as a direction for your intent. So thank you. Thank you for my chance to comment.
Yeah, I think I'd add that the state's job would be in helping businesses establish themselves. I'm not sure what a stable market is. I've never seen one in the cattle business. But when that happens, I think it'd be a good plan for the Department of Ag to at least have some idea in order how you're going to determine what a saturated meat processing industry looks like in Wyoming, because I'm not sure what it is. I do know that things are immensely better. 2-3 years ago, we were scheduling beef to be processed that hadn't been born yet. Now we can get something done in a couple of months. So I appreciate the work. Any further questions, committee?
Fertilizer part.
Well, Department of Ag has more, so you're right. Okay. I don't have a sheet on it, but I think you do.
Mr. Chairman, you and the committee had brought up earlier about the regulation of fertilizer and soil amendments. And we were asked yesterday by LSO if we could have some information. I do have a handout for that. But the only thing and I'll get that handout to you. The only thing I would like to say in regards to that is we do not regulate the production of commercial fertilizer or soil amendments. We only regulate by label guarantees for anything that is sold under those labels. And so that is, as LSO stated, under the the Fertilizer Act in statute. And there is a registration fee for $115 per product that is assessed annually by statute by the Department of Agriculture. And the product must be registered prior to any distribution within the state. Our division, our technical services division, can test, sample, suspend, and cancel registrations of products that are misbranded or adulterated. But we just have a label requirement to be able to sell those. It is our understanding that the EPA is the one that has the guidelines for production of fertilizer and soil amendments. That's not something we at the Department of Agriculture look at. And I will leave you with a handout of that if you have additional questions for us at a different time.
Committee, any more questions? All right, oh, yes. Go ahead. Co-Chairman Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you don't regulate at all if someone was wanting to spread compost or manure, if it's, for example, lots of farmers or people spread their own manure on their own place, or they don't sell it, but their neighbor comes and gets a truckload of it. That's not regulated by you at all.
Mr. Chairman, ours is all for commercial sale is when we require the registration. So if you're doing application on your own property, we are not involved in that at all from the Department of Agriculture's perspective.
So if you were composting and wanted to just give it away, it wouldn't be a problem.
Mr. Chairman, my understanding is that it's for commercial sale is when we are required to monitor that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. So the next on our list is DEQ. So ladies, if you'd come on up, work your way up here.
Probably not. I didn't see her handout. He said they had a handout.
Yeah. I guess we're a little unclear on the handout, Julie. Will it be emailed to us? Okay. We'll get it from LSO probably. welcome to our committee. Go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Jennifer Zigmund. I am the Water Quality Division Administrator at the Wyoming DEQ.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Suzanne Ingles, and I am the Administrator for the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division at DEQ.
Okay. Do you have something prepared for us, or you're here to answer? Okay. Go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman, I'm prepared to
Go ahead.
talk about water quality permits for the wastewater management at meat processing facilities.
Okay.
If you'd like me to start there, I'd be happy to, or I can let Suzanne describe what she will be presenting today.
Yeah,
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, I can speak to the LSO memo and items that were highlighted there. And I can probably touch on a little bit of what was just discussed with EPA and composting biosolids. Just
okay.
So-
We'll start with you, Jennifer. I think I'm getting it out of order on our schedule, but we'll go ahead and start with that. We just toured some wastewater
Great.
possible problems that we need help with.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to provide an overview. So what I'll talk about today is what the Water Quality Division permits and why, and then some potential solutions to address what I think may be some concerns regarding the facilities that you toured yesterday. So first, the DEQ Water Quality Division, we do permit facilities that dispose of wastewater from meat processing plants in order to protect human health and the environment. Specifically, the authority to do that comes from the Wyoming Environmental Quality Act, which requires us to permit sewage treatment and disposal systems capable of causing or contributing to pollution. I think it probably goes without saying, but we write these permits in order to protect human health and the environment, to make sure that pollutants from the wastewater don't contaminate surface water and groundwater. The pollutants of primary interest that we'd be looking at from wastewater for meat processing plants would be nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and bacteria. And when we talk about treatment options for these wastewater streams, some of the challenges would be treating for the fats, oil, and grease. The high blood content would provide a lot of nutrients. And then if you have things like hair and other solids, you may need some kind of pre-treatment component to the system that you're using. So for the meat processing plants that we've seen in Wyoming, I would say groundwater is typically the primary concern that we see in order of what we're trying to protect. And that's largely because of the disposal options used by these facilities and the locations, which are often in rural areas. In those areas, because groundwater is often used to supply public water system wells or private well owners, it is, again, important to make sure that we are protecting the groundwater in the area. So again, in terms of how we permit these systems, the Environmental Quality Act allows us to write permits to construct for these facilities, and that's solely under state statutes. Other types of wastewater systems, however, may fall under what's called our groundwater underground injection control program. That is a federally delegated program that Wyoming has authority to implement under the Safe Drinking Water Act. If a facility wanted to, they could also discharge waste to a surface water of the state, and we would do that under what's called our WIPDES program, or Point Source Discharge Permitting Program. That's another federally delegated program that Wyoming has authority to implement. We've not seen that with any meat processing plants within the state, but I'll mention that as an option, although I don't really expect that to be a largely used treatment system or disposal option.
Could I just interrupt a little bit? So if they were to do that, do they have to have some kind of a sewage treatment of sorts before it's discharged?
Yes,
Or are
Mr.
you going to get into that?
I won't go into
Okay.
a lot of detail, but to answer your question, the answer is yes. They would need to have some kind of treatment system in order to meet effluent limits to be protective of the stream or the river that would receive the waste. So again, these meat processing plants can have different types and volumes of waste streams, and so they have different options on how to manage that waste, and that will determine what kind of permit is required. For the purposes of the discussion here today, I am strictly going to be talking about waste streams that just have the waste from the meat processing plants. Somebody could have the option to add in domestic sewage waste into the waste treatment system and manage those together. We don't typically see that very often. So again, just to keep the discussion fairly simple today, I'll just keep it to what we would permit for the waste from the meat processing plant itself. So in terms of the options that the wastewater disposal methods for a meat processing plant, the first option is to connect to the city sewer system. We have seen this in 2 locations in Wyoming. This would be permitted under an individual permit to construct through our water and wastewater section. We do not require a public notice for those permits. So typically it's about a 60-day turnaround time, although I would say we typically churn those out in a shorter period of time. Similarly, a plant could discharge to a holding tank, which is basically just an underground tank that is pumped periodically and the waste is transported to a different facility for disposal. That would also be permitted under an individual permit to construct through the water and wastewater section. Again, no public notice and estimate 60-day turnaround time on those permits. Another option would be to discharge to a lined lagoon, also known as an evaporation pond, or this could be a facultative lagoon with aeration. Again, an individual permit to construct, no public notice, about 60 days to issue those permits. The option that we most typically see for meat processing plants within the state would be discharged to some kind of septic system or non-lined lagoon. And basically now we're getting into where we're using treatment by infiltrating that wastewater through the soil. And because of that treatment methodology, that is what would kick those permits into our underground injection control program, again, a federally delegated program under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So we permit those through our groundwater UIC program. They're called Class 5 permits. If the facility is under 2,000 gallons per day, we can permit those under a general permit, meaning that it's a fairly straightforward process, no public notice, and again, about a 60-day turnaround time at the most. When we get into UIC facilities, we do typically require monitoring for those facilities, particularly if it's over 2,000 gallons per day, at which point we would have to write an individual UIC permit for those facilities. Those do require a 30-day public notice period. So we're looking at about 90 to 120 days to turn those permits around. And again, when we're talking about septic systems, operators need to think about typically having some kind of pre-treatment component to help remove the oils and grease and hair from the waste stream to make sure that the septic system can treat that waste effectively. So that's an overview of the permits. I'd be happy to answer questions. I know that was throwing a lot of information at you, but to give you a sense of what we do have in the state, we have 11 plants with water quality permits total. Again, most of those are using some kind of septic system, leach field, holding tank combination. We have 8 facilities using that system. We have 1 facility with a lined lagoon, and again, 2 facilities that are connected to city sewer. So depending on the type of permit that we issue to these facilities, those options that we just covered, we have different rules that outline the permit requirements, the application content, and then design and construction standards that those systems have to meet. Chapter 3 of our rules outlines the permit to construct requirements. Chapter 27 outlines our underground injection control permit requirements. Chapter 11 is our design and construction standards for wastewater systems. And then Chapter 25 is design and construction standards for septic systems. And again, this is where in our rules, we establish what permit requirements apply, what we need to see in the application, whether or not we need monitoring, and what the design and construction standards are for those different types of systems. So in terms of what I think is one of the top interests today for this discussion would be using lagoons as a treatment disposal method for these meat processing plants. Whether or not that's a permit to construct or a UIC permit, the design and construction standards for lagoons point back to Chapter 11, which is where we say, okay, if you're going to build a lagoon, here's the size it has to be. Does it have to have aeration? What are the other technical components in order to make that an effective system? And in terms of looking at the question of how do we be protective of the environment, but are there areas where we can improve the efficiency with how we permit these systems? I think one option that I would put forth to the committee's consideration today, in terms of thinking about this with my engineers, in terms of solutions is that it may be timely for us to look at Chapter 11. Chapter 11 was first promulgated in 1984, and it has not been substantially updated since that time. So it is one of our older rule packages. When we wrote that rule, meat processing plants weren't really a facility contemplated at that time. So when we look at the technical specs in our rule now, those specifications are more written for municipal lagoons, for domestic sewage, or commercial and industrial waste. Meat processing plants are not technically domestic sewage. Domestic sewage refers only to human waste, but they aren't really a commercial industrial facility either. It's kind of a in-between area where it's domestic-like sewage. And so again, because we did not contemplate meat processing plants in 1984, nor have they really been in the spotlight since that time, I think one option that if the committee is interested in us pursuing this, we could consider pursuing rulemaking to update Chapter 11 to incorporate technical specifications specific to meat processing plant lagoons. If we did that, we do not need any statute changes. We would simply undertake a rulemaking revision process. Our rulemaking process usually starts with scoping with the industry affected by those rules. So we would like to consult with the meat processing plant industries to get input on what this rule revision could look like. Just to give you an overview of our rulemaking process from there, we would draft the rule. It goes through several rounds of Attorney General review. We take it to a Water and Wastewater Advisory Board, the Environmental Quality Council, and eventually the governor for approval. It's a long process. Again, if the committee is interested in us considering this as a solution, I would say it would take at least 1 year, probably more, to pass rules. And we would need to keep those edits solely to what we're trying to do for meat processing plants. We need a lot of other updates to Chapter 11, but that will make it a multi-year process. We have quickly looked at other states to see if they have incorporated rules into their wastewater design and construction standards, and we're not really seeing a model that could be easily recreated here in Wyoming. So it doesn't appear that other states have tackled this issue directly either. But we do have some information from Texas. They may have some language that could help us, and EPA guidelines may also provide some insight into appropriate specifications for lagoons for meat processing plants. So, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks, and I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Committee questions? Representative Davis.
Are digesters an option for this effluent? Or are they even considered? I've heard about them doing through other processes, but.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. That is a very good question. I know we have waste to permit digesters for other types of facilities. I don't know if digesters would be a feasible solution for the wastewater from a meat processing plant, but I'd be happy to look into that and get back to the committee.
Thank you. Senator Hicks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jennifer, it's hard to sit here and say that we would want you to move forward with a modification to Chapter 11 until we actually saw a draft of what those looked like. What we don't want to do is create another onerous regulatory process just carved out for another sector in industry. So it's absolutely, in my opinion, without some specific recommendations to how this would either facilitate, streamline, or reduce the regulatory burden on a meat processing facilities. I can't provide or suggest any guidance until we had a recommendation back from the department as to what that looked like. Where did that streamline, reduce the regulatory timeframe or cost of construction and compliance? Those are the issues that we would have to have back from you guys. Probably working a little bit with our LSO staff to make those recommendations. So bar that, given that exercise, what's the other alternative?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, first to your point about recommendations and what that draft would look like. We could look into that further and sketch out potentially what the new specifications would look like, and to maybe clarify in my previous message, I think what we're challenged here with the meat processing plants that are being envisioned in Wyoming would be they're going to be relatively small volume. And that's where I think if we look at our specifications now, they could be over-designed because again, they're contemplating large volumes of domestic sewage or large volumes from a commercial or industrial facility. So I think the first thing that we would look at would be, are those specifications appropriate for the relatively low volumes that we would be looking at from a meat processing plant? But again, if it's the direction of this committee, we would be happy to sketch out some more detail, if that would help you make a decision on whether or not we pursue rulemaking. In terms of other options, so again, by and large, what we're seeing as the chosen disposal option for meat processing plants so far in Wyoming are the septic systems. For those specifications, I think those are appropriate at this time, and most of those have been permitted under the general permit option. Most of those have been below 2,000 gallons per day, meaning that it's a fairly short time to turn around those permits. So I think for any small volume systems that use a septic system that can get a general permit, it's about as streamlined as we could do at this time. When we get into the UIC facilities, again, we're talking about federal regulations that we have to be at least as stringent as. In those cases, I don't think we're more stringent than the federal regulations. So I don't have any immediate solutions on how to streamline the septic system option. And again, because they're general permits, I think they're pretty quick turnaround as it is.
Now, Mr. Chairman, follow up. So that gets us back into the existing, I think you said that the most common methodology right now is for the 1,500 gallons or less UIC class 5, which is the unlined pits. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, so the UIC class 5 would be anything 2,000 gallons per day or greater. Anything less, we would do a septic system through our permits to construct.
The septic system could include an unlined pit or not?
Mr. Chairman, an unlined pit would be a UIC facility.
Okay.
Correct.
And the problem with the UIC facility, as I see it, is the monitoring requirement associated with all the monitoring mills. That pretty makes that not a viable option for a small facility. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, yes, the UIC permits will require monitoring, and that is a federal requirement. And we do understand that it can be a challenge for the small facilities because it is a federal requirement. I don't know that we have any flexibility over that. I would have to look into some more detail there to confirm that.
So what does UIC stand for, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, UIC stands for the Underground Injection Control.
Yeah, so how do we have an unlined pit that has passive infiltration under an injection control permit?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So anytime we are infiltrating wastewater through the ground and basically using that soil as part of the treatment for the facility and removing pollutants, that is when it would kick it into the UIC program under the class 5 wells.
And that's, Mr. Chairman, that's federal guidelines?
Mr. Chairman, that
Even
is
for passive infiltration.
correct. That is federal under the UIC program.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, just one follow-up when we get back into, so now we're back into the lined pit type or lagoon scenario. Within the engineering and construction design specifications, does it always require a liner, or is there other alternatives that are out there, AKA bentonite, sealing of these type of pits? Or are we always into an engineered liner system?
Mr. Chairman, I will need to confirm specifically for this type of system, but in general, when we're talking about a liner, that is often a synthetic liner, but in many cases, it can also be a bentonite liner or a compacted clay liner. So we have those options. And so in terms of thinking about specifications for meat processing plants, if a liner is needed to not have that infiltration, that is something that we could look at. Does it have to be a synthetic liner? Could it be a compacted clay liner? If I'm understanding your question or your comment.
And so the natural extension of that, Mr. Chairman, is just one more follow-up, is sometimes, particularly in this state, locations, everything, you really don't need to import bentonite when the whole soil is bentonitic to begin with. And so is that taken into consideration if a facility was in a bentonitic soil to begin with, would be sufficient for meeting the liner component or not?
Mr. Chairman, so again, specifically for these types of facilities, if that's not something that we're already considering, I think it could be through the rulemaking revisions that we are contemplating. Because again, if somebody could demonstrate that you have that protection through the compacted clay layer, that would be sufficient to protect the groundwater. That's the assurance that we are looking for.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I guess a kind of a follow-up I'd have on that. So the federal guidelines considering the passive infiltration, which we're calling injection. We could get past those guidelines through rulemaking of our own. I think that's what's being indicated here. So
Mr. Chairman, we, through the federally delegated program under the Safe Drinking Water Act for UIC, we cannot change the federal regulations that we have to meet, meaning we have to be at least as stringent as the Code of Federal Regulations. But our UIC program, if somebody is building an unlined lagoon, it points back to the design and construction standards that we have within our Chapter 11. So it's a mix of federal requirements and then the design and construction standards that we promulgate for all wastewater systems. So within the design and construction standards on how we build those systems, that's where we have some flexibility. So there's some aspects of UIC that we can't change, the 2,000 gallons per day, the monitoring requirements. But the exact specifications we have for those facilities about how they're going to be protective, that's where we do have some flexibility within our rulemaking.
okay, thank you. Co-Chairman Steinmetz, did you, and we have, okay, Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to, I guess, touch back on the Line Lagoon situation, because we had an example yesterday of that. And I found your statement about, well, it may be over-designed. Let me assure you, it's thousands of % over-designed. Okay, there's no doubt about it. That all being said, I understand you've got rules you're following that you promulgated, but is there any, I mean, first of all, that situation is terrible. You know, I guess I'll just touch on the fact that if businesses are doing a certain thing and you have other options out there, whatever they've done is most likely the least expensive thing to do, right? Whatever you think or whatever your options are, the relevant facts are is businesses will do what's cheapest for them, right? You made them put in this crazy lagoon system with massive amounts of storage that doesn't seem to get used. And my main concern, though, to all this is, what are your internal mechanisms within the DEQ to evaluate this before we're here in this meeting going, well, what in the heck is this pit we've created here that is obviously over-engineered? And so it's just blatantly a fact. So what do you do internally before it comes to this point to say, you know, hey, I think we might have a problem here with these facilities that weren't contemplated back in the day? What do you do to try to get ahead of that instead of being, you know, reactive, you're proactive? So I guess I'd like to hear if there is a process within the department to look at what we did, what I just tried to understand. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the question. We understand the concern. When we receive a new application, if it's not straightforward, absolutely, we meet with the applicant and we advise them on the potential options and the solutions. For the facility yesterday, I know there were meetings between my engineering staff and the facility about, all right, here are the different permitting options. Here's how we would go about permitting this if you did a septic system. Here's what we would do if we did a lagoon. This was a facility where we had several discussions because there were some gray areas, again, in our rules about these facilities. So recognizing that what we try to do in all circumstances is make sure that people understand the option, what our rule requirements are, and to help advise them about which option they may want to go depending on their timelines. Are they looking for a permit immediately, or can they work with a longer timeline where we have to send a permit to public notice? So absolutely, we do try to meet with all permittees if there's questions about the facility and which option they should choose, about what our requirements are for each different type of permit, and advise them about the best path forward.
Follow up.
Yeah, thank you for, I guess, explaining that. I did a poor job of trying to, I guess, request what I'm looking for. I'll rephrase. Internally, within your organization, I know you have rules, okay? I know you got lots of rules, mostly federal, that you follow. But within your organization, when you find a deficiency, and I'll call it a deficiency in your engineering standards, what do you do to try to correct that internally? I know you talk to the folks and I know you tell them what they can do. That's irrelevant to what I'm asking. I'm asking, what do you do internally to try to make this better? Besides having to come in front of a committee and saying, and them asking, well, what are you doing and why are you doing it? Is there any process internally that you have that tries to refine the rules to fit the real world? Did I do a better job?
Yeah,
Thank you.
yes, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for clarifying your question. When we identify these problems with the rules, we schedule them for updates. I will tell you that it is challenging. When we're talking about updating a rule like Chapter 11, it's going to take several years to do that. If we're talking about broad revisions, we just updated Chapter 12, which is our design and construction standards for public water systems. That took us about 10 years start to finish. We have many rules that we're trying to tackle. A lot of it just comes down, honestly, to staffing resources and needing to prioritize what we're doing when. Chapter 11 is absolutely on our radar for broad updates. If we need to prioritize changes specifically for meat processing plants, that is something that we would happy to make a higher we would be happy to make that a higher priority.
Can we work on Chapter 11 in a real narrow way and just work on meat processing and not without having to go into detail with all of the other updates that need to happen? I guess I'm unclear on that, or do you have to just go through the whole rulemaking process once you open it up?
Mr. Chairman, if it is the direction of this committee to prioritize updates to Chapter 11 for meat processing plants, my recommendation to our director would be that we make a very specific revision to Chapter 11 just for that purpose. When we're updating our rules right now, they have to go through a detailed Attorney General review, and those are resulting in broad updates. And again, if we open up all of Chapter 11, we'd want to scope that with a broad group of industry folks. Even if we do a precision strike for meat processing plants, however, again, I would say 1 year at a minimum, just given the time frame from scoping, advisory boards, Environmental Quality Council, and final approval.
Senator Steinmetz, can you remember what you wanted to add?
Mr. Chairman, a little bit. So I have two questions. We'll start with the first, and I know we've had this discussion before, but maybe we've discovered new information. But when does the dilution rate of the water become such that it's not contaminated any longer, and it doesn't have to be treated like a contaminant? Because our processors are capturing 90% of their blood, which is most of the contamination that we see occur, or most of the concern as far as the regulations that I've read through. And that's being captured and taken to the landfill or wherever they're disposing of it. So it's not going down the drain. Is there any thought to that and the dilution rate, and when that becomes something that's not considered hazardous to the aquifer? Or, can you answer that for me?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So the best answer I can give is that we'd have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. But if we had some demonstration that the water going into a lagoon, a pond, or pit had no pollutants of concern in it, or not at levels that would be at risk to the groundwater, we would need to look at that on a case-by-case basis to determine if that pond or pit still constitutes a treatment facility. The treatment method that you're using to achieve those low concentrations would still require a permit, but then it might simplify the permitting of the actual treatment pond or holding pond if we could show that, there were no constituents at levels of concern. Potentially that could change how we look at design construction standards for that pond or pit or lagoon.
All right, and follow up, Mr. Chairman. So, and I don't think we need to get too, if we only have one lagoon in the entire state, I don't know that we want to get too hung up on it per se. And yet at the same time, I can see where processors that are looking to go a little bit larger are being restricted in an area in this area because they're unable to comply. And so it becomes cost prohibitive to even look at building the plant, or if they get partially down the road, which is what happened in the case that we've referenced all day today, that they were up against the wall and forced to find more funding in order to complete their project, because this was really the only viable option, because they were told that they would be using more water than they anticipated that they would. So I guess the whole thing needs to be looked at more holistically, I think, than just one. That looking at just the lagoon regulation, I think it needs, Senator Kolb made some really good points about how you measure things internally and what processes are there on the front end of things, because when you get to the back end and you're in the middle of construction, there aren't a lot of options afforded to a business that's made it that far. Then my second question is, we've talked a lot about guidelines and then regulations. And so in my mind, there's a distinction between those two. Does the office consider a federal guideline to be different than an actual federal regulation or law?
Mr. Chairman, yes. So again, when we have a federally delegated program, we have to be as stringent as the federal regulations. Federal guidelines, we would interpret as guidelines, not the regulations. So when we're looking at our stringency to be in line with federal regulations, we're only looking at the federal regulations and not the guidelines.
All right. So then how are guidelines treated?
Guidelines, federal guidelines for us would be the same as guidance that we put out to our regulated community, and that it's guidance, it's to help with outreach or to help advise or to help the regulated community understand options, but it is not a regulatory requirement. It's not a legally enforceable requirement, which is what we have in rules. So again, rules cover our legally enforceable requirements. Things that we put out via guidance are recommendations, advice, or outreach related material.
All right. Thank you very much.
Couple more questions. Representative Almond.
Mr. Chairman, just a real quick question. Does the state of Wyoming have very many rules that go way over and above the federal rules and regulations?
Mr. Chairman, in general, I would say no. I'm not prepared today to give a program by program, I guess, report on where we may have some discrepancies, but in general, no, we write our programs to be as stringent as the federal requirements. There may be some specific things where Wyoming has chosen to do something different. So that's a very general answer. I know that that's a question of interest to many groups right now in terms of larger questions that have been posed to the agency. We are compiling some more detailed information to answer that question. But in general, no, our goal is to be as stringent as the federal requirements. And then if there's any specific direction that Wyoming chooses to put into our regulations, we may have some Wyoming specific regulations applicable.
Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just had a couple follow-up questions so I can clearly understand, I guess, the regs in my mind. So if a plant is under 2,000 gallons a day, they can do a septic system. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, they can do a septic system, whether they're below or over 2,000 gallons per day. If they're under 2,000, it's a permit to construct over UIC permit.
Okay. And so if they're under 2,000, they don't have to have injection well monitoring. They wouldn't have to have monitoring on location if they're under the 2,000 gallons. Am I understanding that right?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. I, as the administrator, have the ability to require monitoring for permit to construct, but it is rare when that happens.
Okay. And then my last question is, you mentioned, I think we have did you say 11 permits? Is that right? Related to processing plants?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. We have 11 plants that have water quality permits.
And then the remaining plants, because we have many more than that in Wyoming, are exempt somehow or grandfathered, or where do they fall in the whole permit scheme?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know how to answer. I'm not familiar with how they're managing the waste at those facilities. When we did a search through our water quality permits, these are the facilities, the 11 facilities that we brought up. So I don't know if the other facilities, how they are managing their waste disposal. We have not done an exhaustive search of all plants within the state and a comparison of permits.
Representative Davis.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you alluded to that there were two that were, say, in the cities dumping into the domestic, okay? So there, I'm assuming there'd be a trap and stuff like that to prevent the grease and things like that for on behalf of the cities. But still, that pollutant is going into the city and then it is coming out of their discharge permit. Wouldn't that option be available to these small facilities? You know, dilution is part of, or pollution is part of dilution, or however that goes together, you know. Can they refine their water far enough down to get a discharge permit also?
Mr. Chairman, any facility could use that option to connect to the city sewer if the infrastructure is in place. It just mostly depends on the location, if they're close enough to city sewer line to connect. And then it's an agreement between that facility and the plant as to the waste and any pretreatment that's required, such that what they're contributing to the city's treatment plant doesn't upset the plant and they can still meet their discharge effluent limits. So that's absolutely an option for anybody. If a plant, or I'm sorry, if a meat processing plant had a way to treat their waste such that they could discharge it directly to a stream or river themselves, that is absolutely an option as well. And that again goes through our point source discharge permitting program. It's a federal program. Those are individual permits that do require a public notice. So that is an option. We have not seen interest to date from small plants to use that option.
Senator Kolb.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Got a question that's going to revolve around your internal policies and procedures. And it has to do with the very broad issue that you brought up about you're following federal guidelines, right? It's certainly a debatable question if you exceeded those guidelines, right? You can debate, maybe it's too much, maybe it's too little, maybe folks don't know enough. So internally, do you ever have conversations that say, are we going too far? Are we assuming something? Are we trying to keep up with somebody else's, a counterpart in another state? And I understand a certain division of yours very well. And I just have a general question is there any conversations that you have about, are we going too far, folks? Is this the minimum we have to comply with? You know, and then secondarily, another question would be have you ever been in jeopardy of losing the state primacy when it comes to DEQ in any division because of, say, under compliance with the feds? And what would that look like to us if you did lose? I mean, what consequences are there for us not having primacy? Because I'm not sold on your idea that we're better off, when in fact we have to comply, well, apparently with the minimum perceived standards of the DEQ. Why are we better off having home rule? I'm really kind of fuzzy on this, and I'd like to hear what you had to say on those. I know I threw a lot at you, and I'm just trying to understand what's going on at a level of your government that I don't know a lot about, and I think the public would like to know.
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, to your first point, absolutely. I can speak for the Water Quality Division. I cannot speak for the whole agency on your questions, some very good questions and concerns. Absolutely. I take my role very seriously to make sure that we are implementing appropriate requirements to be protective of the environment, but not overly protective. I think it is a constant challenge for regulators, and we have to be asking that question and looking for answers as to, are we instituting the appropriate amount of regulation, or are we going too far? That is a big part of our jobs and something that we take very seriously and grapple with on a day-to-day basis. A big part of our jobs right now is monitoring what's going on at the federal level for our federally delegated programs, because what changes in the federal rules trickles down to us. So it is, there's a lot going on federally right now, and it's a big part of our jobs to be speaking for Wyoming helping inform those federal regulations and making sure that they are appropriate for small rural western states such as Wyoming. It's challenging in terms of primacy. Wyoming knows Wyoming, and I think that's the best way to say it. We know our state, we know our regulated community, we know our public, we know our waters. I think we are best suited to implement programs where we can and where the legislature has directed us to take over those programs because we know our state the best, and within the flexibility we have, we can tailor our programs to meet the needs of our state better than EPA Region 8 could. And that is the risk, is that if we do not issue these permits, the program goes back to EPA Region 8, and they would then be writing all of the permits for Wyoming instead of people who know Wyoming the best. That's a very short answer to a big question. Again, I know this is a topic of broader interest for the state and the legislature. At our agency, we are compiling information about our primacy programs. Where are there any areas where we are more stringent than, or I'm sorry, where we go beyond federal requirements? So again, I can only speak for the Water Quality Division today. I cannot speak for the agency, but those are the perspectives from my division.
Go ahead, John.
Follow up. So on the question of have we ever been in jeopardy of losing our status as primacy? I think, you know, it's obviously very complex, but frankly, can you reassure anyone that we haven't gone too far? I mean, I get the Wyoming's best decisions, but it seems like it's a shell game between, hey, if we don't do it, they'll do it, and it's worse off for you. Well, tell me why that's true. I don't get it. It seems like a justification to do exactly what the feds say. And if we don't ever have it, you can tell me if we ever had a challenge to what we're doing in the state of Wyoming and they were going to take away primacy, and you had to react to that, right? I would suspect that if you don't do that, if you don't have those conversations with the federal government, you're probably over regulating because the federal government hasn't challenged anything you've done. So I'd like to really find out, have they? I mean, I don't know this. I'm just asking an open-ended question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, to answer that, we have had challenges in the past. A couple examples that I can think of would primarily be through our WPDES, our Wyoming Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. That's a federally delegated program for point source discharge permitting. In the past, that there's been groups that have said that we have not done enough to permit those facilities in Wyoming, and there were challenges for EPA to take that program back. Obviously, that did not happen. We've had other challenges through our Clean Water Act programs for, say, total maximum daily load development. We've had lawsuits related to that, where groups wanted EPA to step in over the state to override some of our decisions. Most recently, we have primacy for the Class 6 underground injection control program under the Safe Drinking Water Act. This is for carbon storage. There's already groups interested in saying that we're not being protective enough and EPA should take over that program. Those are a few examples. Again, I'm not prepared today to go into an exhaustive list, but I would say, yes, there have been challenges in the past, and it's important for us to again, retain that primacy to make sure that we are best implementing these programs for the benefit of Wyoming.
I might add that I think if we hadn't been complying with federal guidelines and we'd have lost one of these plants due to a violation that was receiving COVID funding, they would have lost a lot of money. So I appreciate that we're thorough, but we'll still work on the idea that things could be made easier for business in Wyoming. Any further questions, committee, on solid or water quality? We're gonna do something a little different. I'm gonna split in the middle of yours because we probably need a break. The next part will take a while. So I think we'll do a 5-minute break and not long. Well, committee, start gathering up. We're going to start again. I don't know if they hear out there or not. Could you hear me out there?
I wasn't out there.
Oh, you weren't out there. Thanks, Alan. I told them 5 and so I think committee, if we'll settle down, LSO, you're ready and we're live. Okay. When you're ready to go on the next segment, Ms. Ingles,
Read that, but tell me what.
go ahead and start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just reintroduce myself. Suzanne Ingles. I'm the administrator for the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division. And I'm here today to talk with you about dead animal composting and can go over a little bit of the LSO memo that Ms. Shippen discussed with you first thing this morning. So just a little bit of background. The Solid and Hazardous Waste Division implements the federal standards found in the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, commonly known as RCRA, for both the hazardous waste as well as non-hazardous waste, solid waste. And Wyoming received partial program approval from EPA for solid waste back in 1995, with full program approval in 1997. So Wyoming statute and regulations give DEQ the authority to permit solid waste management facilities. And as part of the solid waste rules, the dead animals are considered municipal solid waste. And as the LSO memo highlighted, there is an exemption for farm and ranch operations to manage their own waste on site that is incidental to their own operations. Otherwise, management of solid waste is really left up to municipalities and those operating landfills and transfer stations. I believe Ms. Shippen highlighted that in her presentation to you. The agency does not dictate to municipalities how they manage solid waste. If they choose to receive a certain type, that's their decision, and whether or not they dispose of them or compost them. So guideline 27, the agency finalized that guidance document in 2022. We did that after we held a dead animal summit in 2021, where DEQ, solid and hazardous waste staff, water quality division staff, Game and Fish, Department of Ag, WYDOT, landfill operators, and meat processors all came together, and we held a summit to discuss management of this type of waste. And one of the pieces of information that we took away as an agency was that there just needed to be a little bit more clarification, guidance on how to manage dead animals. What are the options out there, which is how guideline 27 came about. We also sought input from the Wyoming Meat Processing Association in 2021 before we finalized this document. This document highlights the options as disposal, compost, incineration, and rendering. As far as disposal of dead animals goes, the guidance document highlights that it is allowed at municipal solid waste landfills. And I think there's been some discussion of lined leachate collection facilities. That is an option for MSW landfills as well as what's called a performance-based design, where a facility can go through a demonstration and show that their disposal site is geologically secure and that groundwater contamination will be prevented. So that is an option already allowed in statute and our rules and mentioned briefly in this guidance document. There are 20 landfills that bury dead animals throughout the state and 13 transfer stations that accept dead animals for transfer to a landfill. Specific to composting, there is the other guidance document that the agency worked together with Department of Ag back in 2006 to finalize on best management practices, how to compost dead animals. It just highlights the location, construction, operation, final uses of that compost material. And there are 3 transfer stations, 3 landfills, and 3 butcher shops in the state that are currently composting. The other 2 options that this guidance document highlights are incineration and rendering. These are not very common options that we see being employed with management of dead animals. A couple of things that the memo highlights is the outreach that the agency has done. We started doing dead animal composting seminars in 2022. We held 3 seminars in 2022, one in Sundance, Bridger Valley, and Bags. And we did that in conjunction with the University of Wyoming Extension Center, where they came in out of Washakie County. They came in and gave a 101 on how to compost. Our agency went over the regulations. And so there was a classroom session, and then we went out into the field and had a hands-on session of how to build a traditional windrow compost pile with dead animals at these different locations. In 2023, just earlier in May, we held these seminars again. One in Moorcroft, here in Torrington, and then also in Cody. I think I would just want to also add these compost seminars. They've been well attended by a variety of municipalities, meat processors, game and fish, consultants, and we've received positive feedback. We're hoping to do these in the future on an annual basis to ensure that if somebody is interested in composting dead animals, that we can provide them the tools that they need.
Okay, committee, I guess I'd start out with a question while we're on that. If people are interested in composting the dead animals, can they use just the principles of composting, which is to pile it and heat it and stir it? And then when they apply it as raw manure or some other product rather than compost, because the compost has a strict set of guidelines as to what is composting. Can you explain part of that piece for us?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. Our guideline 17 goes into the general practices of how to compost, checking temperature, the carbon nitrogen balance, moisture content. So if someone is generally composting along those lines and they have a finished product, a finished completely composted material, the agency, the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division, does not have requirements on what those standards would be to land apply it. We say that it can be land applied, and we recommend that the finished compost is tested, as well as the soils as to where it will be land applied. But we don't actually have any requirements for that.
Questions, committee?
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, go ahead.
just a question. This is why the department is emphasizing compost over burial. And I guess I'm trying to find your guidance number 27 on the, that you'd mentioned and stuff, but why the emphasis on composting over just burial? And then on the burial issue, on the performance guideline, could you just go through those as far as lined, unlined, and the monitoring requirements associated with each one of those?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks. I don't believe the department is pushing compost as an option over disposal. It's just another option. And based on our discussions with meat processors and landfill operators, it was something that they were interested in. And so we thought we could provide this as a resource. There is a lot of information on how to compost on the web, just a simple Google search. But we thought a classroom session as well as a hands-on learning experience would be beneficial. So that's why we've started offering those seminars. It was just another tool in the toolbox.
So I won't argue with you on that, but I have a number of landfills that would argue with that point that you just made. And primarily it gets with the closure of some of these and then having these transfers. And then being told that they were going to have to transfer the offal and the carcasses, which I think everybody gets this image of a semi-load of dead animals and stuff with the leakage going down the interstate. It's just not a pleasant sight to contemplate. And so when we went through that issue, it became pretty apparent that then it has to be in containers, which starts to get very expensive. And a number of the landfills that I were dealt with. And so what I basically said, the only other option that was presented to them by the department was to compost those at these transfer facilities. It was never an option that was presented. And this has been a couple of years ago. And hopefully we've got past that point, but the burial is still, particularly, is it a permittable activity on a transfer facility to have a burial site also?
Chairman, Senator Hicks, burial would be considered a landfill of any type of solid waste. So they would have to go through a permit process for a landfill.
But it could be permitted at a transfer site. Because the vast majority of our landfills have been closed. And now they're no more than just transfer sites, or they may maintain a demolition pit that's permittable. Can you permit at a transfer site a burial pit?
So what we, Mr. Chairman, Senator, we would look at the facility as a whole. And yes, the ultimate answer to your question is, can someone have a transfer station and a landfill all within one permitted boundary? Yes. I'm trying to think offhand if we have any. Most facilities have separate permit boundaries for each of those facilities. The standards are different based on the rules. But I believe it would be possible.
So a couple issues. What are the performance guidelines that allow burying on these, whether it's a permitted municipal landfill or a transfer facility that has the other permitted uses on there? Does this still require the rigorous groundwater monitoring?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, the performance-based design is outlined in statute in 527. And since it's considered a landfill, I believe there are groundwater monitoring requirements. And really the first step to a performance-based design is doing site-specific evaluation to ensure or to evaluate that characterization of the site, the soil types, depth to groundwater, groundwater flow, those sort of things to ensure what I'll say the performance-based design is built to be a substitute for a synthetic liner to show that the existing site would be just as protective as a liner. So if somebody was interested in pursuing this, it is an option to have a strictly dead animal disposal site with a performance-based design.
Okay, so within the performance-based guidelines or the design criteria, this is exactly the same conversation we had as far as the associated with clay line and other pits or soil types and stuff. So, you know, the limitation on this becomes the groundwater monitoring component. You know, I got a little landfill that spends about $600,000 drilling water well to monitor groundwater component in very bentonitic soils. Long story short is when we do these, do we look at the soil? Again, back to the scientific literature would indicate that nitrates are the issues with dead animal pits and potential groundwater contamination. Would you agree with that characterization?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, we do evaluate the soil at a specific site to determine if a performance-based design would be appropriate.
Okay, so the question is do you look at, or the issue that we're trying to protect here is groundwater contamination from burial pits associated with the leachate of nitrates out of those. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, correct.
All right, thank you. And so how does the soils component play into that nitrate component of potential groundwater contamination? What would you look at on the soils profile that would tell you that there's probably a potential issue or not?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I would have to say what the soil makeup. If it's a gravelly site, it would not be a good location for this type
Yeah,
of
I think the
facility.
soils people call that texture. But anyway, so is that actually analyzed as a component? What I'm trying to get to here is there's a number of relatively simple and cheap tests that would indicate that you're probably or most likely not going to have any groundwater contamination without spending $600,000 drilling monitoring wells, which then drives the dead animal burial pits away because of the regulatory avoidance associated with the cost. So then we're back to either putting this in containers, incinerating it, or composting it. And what I'm trying to figure out is within the scheme of the rules and the performance design, if there's a simple component that looks at the soil profile and then makes the determination based on the texture or the composition of clay, which deals with the cation exchange capacity that binds the nitrates up in the soil column, whether that's considered versus having to go through, well, if you're going to do this and you don't want to line it, now you got to go drill $600,000 worth of monitoring wells, quarterly send in, get the samples, send them into the laboratory, provide the reports to the department that there's no nitrate contamination, because effectively that regulatory scheme precludes the ability of rural areas or a meat processor to construct a dead animal pit. And so is there a component within the performance-based guidelines that looks at the soils and makes the determination that they're adequate to protect the groundwater?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, it is part of the evaluation. It's not strictly just on soils.
All right. Can you provide to the committee that exact language is what it requires to this specific issue? So I just want to understand there is nothing more than a soil sample of the sites and the surrounding sites could be sufficient information to provide the department to make a reasonable determination that there will be no contamination without the follow-up of significant groundwater monitoring. Whether that's just one issue, but go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I will say I can provide follow-up information on what is involved with a performance-based design. I'm not sure it's going to meet exactly what you are requesting, since the soil is just one consideration of that. But that is something that I will definitely provide and elaborate on more.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that, because it can be the only consideration, and that's my concern. It's just one of many that's taken into consideration, but it could be the one that checks the box and says the likelihood of any potential contamination is almost zero. versus going through all these additional steps and data collection and engineering and design and permitting to get to that. So if you could do that, it would be very helpful.
Understood.
So in general, it's probably going to be a more exhaustive permitting process to landfill them or dig a hole and bury them on your site than it would be to compost them.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
Okay.
And I would also like to add that composting can be done on the site. It doesn't have to be done in a container. That's not a requirement of ours.
All right. Senator Colton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General question about lined, unlined pits for garbage disposal. How many have you permitted that have not been lined in, say, in the last, I don't know, 2 years recently, compared to lined to unlined? Have you permitted any unlined pits during this time period? That's what thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, there are a total of 3 unlined landfill locations in the state. The remaining of them are lined. They have a very long lifespan, so they don't get permitted on an annual basis, and they have lifetime permits that are valid for at least 25 years. So the remaining landfills that we have in the state, and there's about 30 of them, 3 of them are permitted as unlined, and they've gone through the performance-based design.
Senator Kolb.
Yeah, just to follow up with that. So could you help me understand why we had to go through this, I don't know what you'd call it, evolution with waste districts having to line their facilities because of, and the way it's always been, I've heard it as, and the public's heard it, that it was necessary to comply with regulations, else they would have to shut down and then make a transfer station, which is now like, where I come from in Sweetwater. We've got waste district number 1, which is a pretty big facility, but they had to line everything. In the past, they weren't lined, so their costs went through the roof. So where is the requirement? So the difference between an unlined, you're telling me that they're, permitted for a long time. So it's a grandfather permit that you carry on. I'd say that and as categorizing those things. But so what was the reason why we had to change? I mean, what is it? Millions and millions of dollars that had to happen to make this, comply with your what a lot of folks know was your regulations. So could you help me out understand why those liners had to go in when we have sites that aren't lined? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, you're right that for a very long time, landfills operated without a liner or the requirement to have this demonstration that the soils in place were equivalent to a liner. And that was because in the arid West, it was believed that landfills did not generate leachate. However, based on groundwater monitoring that was being done at the landfills, groundwater contamination was being shown. And so this issue was presented to Governor Freudenthal at the time, and he commissioned a group to study this further. And in 2006, the legislature passed legislation that required 2 things. The agency to work with landfill operators to make sure that they had adequate groundwater monitoring networks to ensure, so we could study the groundwater contamination if there was any. And then 2, it required the local communities to conduct what's called an integrated solid waste management plan for them to evaluate how they're managing solid waste, what their long-term plans were. The agency put together a report in 2010 that showed the groundwater contamination at the majority of landfills. I believe 112 landfills were studied. 76 of them had adequate groundwater monitoring networks, and 73 of them show groundwater contamination at them. So based on that information, The requirement to line future cells at landfills is in statute along with the option for performance-based design. There are 3 of them, like I pointed out. Those have happened since the statute was passed, and those integrated solid waste management plans helped the local municipalities decide if they were going to continue operating their landfill, knowing that they would have to line future cells or do this other demonstration and build a transfer station. So though that study that the communities did back in 2009 helped with their decisions.
I don't know, did you have any other things to add in either presentation? Either of you ladies, a question I'd have that might help, it's way off the beaten track, but not that far off. You could answer this question, Ms. Singles. And all of us probably wonder if our little dump on our private ranch is solid waste dump, non-hazardous material. Are those still legal?
Mr. Chairman, on your private ranch, when you're disposing of waste that's generated incidental to your ranch operations, yes, those are exempt.
Okay. So we can probably advise some of our constituents that they're still in compliance. Thank you. Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
No, we've got more questions.
Just-
Did I start up there? I am so sorry. Sorry, folks.
So a couple of things is that, you know, with the memo that LSO staff put together and just looking at the regulatory framework for what we're primarily focused here is on these small slaughter facilities. In South Dakota, it's regulated by the Department of Agriculture. I think they call it some other name, but it's or Nebraska. Or South Dakota. And then in North Dakota, they actually look at this and have called out. So on our regulatory framework, we're calling this stuff municipal waste, which falls into the entire municipal waste category of regulatory framework to deal with municipal waste. And what North Dakota does is call it butcher's waste and has an entire different framework and consideration of how that's handled and stuff. So I'm just wondering my request would be back to the department is to take a look at some of these other regulatory frameworks that Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota has and come back with some potential I see one of the pitfalls that we're running in here is the classification, calling this municipal waste. And so look at some of these other regulatory frameworks that these states have adopted. And I believe it was South Dakota that had anything less than 1,000 cubic yards was exempt from permitting, but they still had a facility that had to follow standards and guidelines, operating procedures and stuff. So I guess the directive, Mr. Chairman, and where I would like to say this is from a regulatory standpoint, from the solid waste division of DEQ, is to look at some of these others and to come up with some streamlined recommendations on how to specifically handle these type of facilities, including maybe reclassifying this, looking at capacity size, and then appropriate entity for oversight. Because it may not necessarily, if we look at this, the one framework that it's exempt from permitting, but they still have operating criteria. And take a look at those and put them up against what we currently do and say, maybe there's a better way to do business, and then come back to our next committee meeting and after a detailed analysis by the department, give us your assessment of a potential path forward. I'm done.
Is everybody done? You're good, John? Okay, well, we'll move on to the next thing. Thank you, ladies. We'll move on to our next topic, which is, well, we were gonna have meat processors and then public. Let's do that first. Do we have, I didn't see any, no meat processors. They took off half the day yesterday to help us. Do we have any? Okay. They took half the day off to show us their plants and they have to work today. So, but it'd be a time for public comment on, and maybe some ideas on what to do with dead animals and butchering waste and what have you. No public comment either. Good.
Mr.
Oh,
Chairman,
go ahead.
I'd like to ask Mr. Kennedy to come up and remind us of what he saw in Kansas when we went on a tour there of a meat processing facility. He talked to me about it in the hallway and I was hoping he'd come up of his own volition, but I'll have to twist his arm.
All right, I got called out.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But we don't want to beat this subject to death.
No, we don't, but
No,
he has some-
no, who would do such a thing? Goodness. Keith, when you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Keith Kennedy, Wyoming Ag Business. Several years ago, the Ag Committee went down to Colorado Springs to Calicrate's processing plant. They actually do the initial slaughter at the feedlot in St. Francis, Kansas. And other than the bone, they compost all of the rest of the waste with their manure on site at the feedlot. And we were just recalling that was how they actually disposed of all of their offal from their plant. And it's actually the same type of facility that you toured yesterday afternoon late. They actually have those on site and it's mobile rather than in a fixed location. The only other thing that I would add from what we talked about earlier, you were talking about disposal of manure and compost, and if there's any restrictions, and the chairman and Senator French are probably the only two familiar with this, but their conservation plans for their crop operation have guidelines for particularly timing. Not so much anything about content, but the fact that manure can't be applied anytime the ground's frozen. So those are really the only restrictions that a crop farmer would have as far as application of manure.
What are they doing with the bones? Because in all the composting I've been around, that's a big problem. They just don't dissolve quickly.
Mr. Chairman, they're actually cooking those for bone broth, and that's how they dispose of it. And after that, I would assume that it's also used as a soil amendment because it's essentially calcium and phosphorus. So, and it's been cooked, so there's no issue with any biological contamination.
Mr. Chairman, I can answer that. So they have, so in their facility down there, they have several small businesses that are working out of the facility that use various byproducts. And one of them is a chef that makes bone broth out of the bones. And then they take the remaining part of the bone after it's been cooked and made into bone broth, and they incinerate it and they make bags of garden fertilizer and sell those. So that's what they do with it.
So we might have some opportunities for an entrepreneur to come in and the business council to help them get their feet under them, doing something with this problem that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Keith.
Thanks, Keith.
All right, we are ready for the University of Wyoming. You've been so patient. Come on up. We have LSO here. Okay, while you're coming up, we have a presentation by the LSO. Anna, go ahead. Yeah, we'll give you a choice of chairs. We put a whole slug of them there. So go ahead when you're ready, Anna.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. This committee requested an overview of the funding process for the University of Wyoming's Cooperative Extension Program. Under Wyoming Statute 21-17-107, which was enacted in 1895, this statute states that the legislature shall appropriate funds intended for the support and maintenance of the university. This statute also indicates that the appropriations shall also apply to all federal funds received by the university for the benefit of the agricultural arts. Wyoming has been accepting federal grants for cooperative extension work under Wyoming Statute 21-17-301 through 308 since 1915. Subsection A of that statute is a declaration of Wyoming's acceptance of federal conditions for the remittance of cooperative extension funds. Subsection C of that statute directs the Board of Trustees of the university to comply with all reporting and other requirements specified by federal law. This subsection does not require the Board of Trustees to report to the legislature on the use of federal cooperative extension funds. Subsection B of that statute authorizes the state treasurer to accept federal funds that are meant for cooperative extension work, and the state treasurer then transfers them to the university's Board of Trustees. In 1915, when the university first began accepting federal funds for cooperative extension work, the non-codified language included in that legislation was very similar to what is now 21-17-304. And then under the Smith-Lever Act, the federal act enacted in 1914 detailing cooperative extension work by colleges, it states that the appropriations made to various states shall be administered by such colleges as the legislature of each state may direct. It would appear that the legislature has seen fit to authorize the University of Wyoming to accept and expend cooperative extension funds without regular legislative appropriations. Federal funds were last appropriated to the university within the budget bill during the 1999-2000 biennium. During the 2001-2002 biennium, Governor Geringer initiated the change to the Modern Block Grant appropriation for the university. The result of that is that the legislature doesn't authorize the expenditure of any non-general funds or the number of full or part-time employees within the university, but this practice isn't based in statute. And then Article 7, Section 15 of the Wyoming Constitution states that federal grants, donations, or devices given to the university shall vest in the university and be exclusively used for the purpose for which they are granted. It is possible that the legislature viewed this authority as sufficient to allow the university to accept and expend federal funds because the treatment of federal funds for purposes of cooperative extension expenditures are no different than any other federal grant, award, or payment in the state legislative appropriations process. Wyoming statute and the history of the state's budget indicate that the legislature has the authority to appropriate federal funds as part of the treasury. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
Questions, committee? So the extension services is funded through the block grant in some way. We don't have it in our general fund anymore.
No.
And it's okay.
Mr. Chairman, no.
All right, that's all right. Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to call out one part of the research where it goes from for the benefit of agriculture and its other and mechanic arts. I had to look this up what mechanic arts was, but it's engineering, other fields of expertise. I just want to be clear that it's more than just agriculture. It's very broad. Thank you. I guess, do you agree?
I do agree. Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Senator Ide.
Oh, we've got another question here. Bob, go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman. I always get queasy when I see federal funding for anything effectively. I don't want to belabor my argument there, but we've got a federal government that is essentially insolvent. We're $31 trillion in debt. They deficit spend at the tune of, pick a number, $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion a year. Is there ever any thought of trying to wean ourselves off of federal funding for any of these programs to help the future generations not be enslaved by our federal government's borrowing and spending habits? Just a question. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, I don't necessarily know that I have an answer to that question.
It's above your pay grade. We might get an idea from others here as to how much federal funding goes to the University of Wyoming. Would that help you,
Yeah.
Senator Ide? Okay, and
Yeah.
Senator Cole.
Yeah, just spurred another thought in my head. So we've got do we have the ability as a legislative body to change what Governor Geringer did back in the day on how they had the funding scheme? I don't know, changed. So that's one. The second one is I'm not running for re-election. I'm going to now be quiet. So thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, go ahead.
can I get Anna out of the hot seat on that question?
You may,
I'll
go
answer the
ahead.
Question. And so this was a subject that I had asked to be put on for consideration as an interim topic that this committee had forwarded on to Management Council. And it's the reason that I wanted it on there was for the very reason that Senator Cole just articulated. So in 2000, there was a decision to change policies, and the policy prior to that is the university's budget came to the Joint Appropriations Committee. They worked the entire budget, including the distribution and the appropriation of the federal funds that came to the state of Wyoming for those purposes. And that's, if you go back to 21-17-107, that's the law, folks. That's in the green books. And it says that the legislature shall appropriate those funds. And then the statutes are pretty replete or complete all the way through there as to what our responsibility as the legislative branch is. And that's to look at these funds, appropriate those funds, monitor the usage of those funds to make sure that they're being used for the appropriate purposes. And it says it all the way up to 21-17-304. It says the legislature shall direct or may direct the use of those funds as long as they're within the context of what the original federal intent was, either Smith-Lever or Morrill Act funds. In my opinion, in a number of years that I served on appropriation, when I was reading the statutes, I said, why did we never see this? And because there was an agreement and a policy decision made to just do a block grant to the University of Wyoming. And so part of the conversation that I wanted to use here is because it's that agreement is not statutory. In fact, that agreement is inconsistent with our statutory responsibilities as a legislature. In other words, we're not following the law. It says we are supposed to review those funds, look at them, and make an appropriate. So the question for this committee is, and I think for the legislature as a broader, are we going to abdicate our responsibility under the law? And if we are, then we need to go in there and modify that and probably codify the block grant model. Or are we going to go back and say we need to fulfill our statutory responsibility? And the construct of the statutes is it looks at all the different federally funding sources. Are we going to appropriate these back? Are we going to monitor their uses and if need, then provide directions on how those federal extension funds or university ag funds or mechanic arts, because this includes, with some of those funds would also include the engineering college. That's why this subject is on here. I think the university's done a very good job of providing us the information that we asked along those lines, but the giant policy question that this committee is going to have to grapple with over the interim is if we're not going to follow the law, then we need to go in there and repeal it. And we probably need to codify that would just be incorporated in as part of the block grant model, or we inclined to go back to the the statutory framework, to follow the law, and require those to go through the appropriations process and the other components of that. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that puts a fine focus on why this subject is here. The ongoing discussions is for this committee to get, because it doesn't go through the appropriations process anymore. We don't know how the funds have been expended. We don't know what the priorities of the university is when it comes to cooperative research program. And so we've asked the university to come here and say, show us what you're doing, how the programs are worked. So we know as an ag committee, how those dollars that are being allocated to the university for these purposes, we don't know, Mr. Chairman. And again, I commend the university for bringing this information at this request. But I think it's the first step in a long process. But this is what we should have been doing all along, is, in my opinion, as a legislature and particularly ag committee, is understanding how those federal dollars are interplaying with the state funds that are appropriated to the Department of Agriculture through the Cooperative Extension Program, and how that's deployed out across the state of Wyoming. So, Mr. Chairman, that's to put a fine point on the discussion here today. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I turn it back over to you, but I wanted to just make sure the committee understood, what we're doing here today and what the policy issues before us are.
Thank you, Senator. So we were just looking at a previous statute, 303, 2117-303, and it seems to indicate that we are complying with law, but if we've got conflicting statutes, we still probably need to deal with it. So any further questions? I guess not. So we'll thank you, Anna. We'll go ahead with the university's presentation, and any point you want to inform us as to how much money comes from the federal government and how hard that might be to wean off, you may do that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Steinmetz, also co-chairing this committee. We're looking forward to working with you on this issue over the next year or so to make sure that we're moving our college in the right direction. First of all, today, I'd like to introduce some of my colleagues here. Kelly Crane, who's Director and Associate Dean of our Extension Program. Mike Smith, who's Vice President of Governmental Affairs and Community Engagement. And then also here with us today are Dr. Eric Webster, who's head of our Agriculture Experiment Station, another program that gets dollars from the federal government in an appropriation. Vicki Boyles, who's our Director of Business Operations, because there's a lot of numbers and spreadsheets in here that if we have some questions, Vicki might be able to help us with that. And also Pepper Jo Six, who's Director of our External Relations Program at the university. Yes, Kelly.
And importantly, our local 4-H youth development educator, Megan Brittingham, has joined us.
Thank you for coming. Okay, so one of the things we did want to do is provide you with a little bit of an update on the college. We've had a number of changes over the years, some very major changes over the last couple of years with our reorganization. And so we want to make sure that you're understanding how at the university and with our college specifically, we're working to serve the state and to provide relevant high quality education to the next generation of agriculture, life science, and natural resource professionals. So I do have some slides. I don't know where those might be here. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so this just gives you a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going to be going today. We are going to be focusing specifically on extension, but we wanted to give you a context of where extension fits into our larger program. So some of the material we're presenting today is going to be looking at our newly reorganized college. So this would be our ag programs, our natural resource programs, in addition to zoology, physiology, wildlife, and botany programs that came into our college last year. And then also some data on the College of Agriculture as we've known it in the past. So our objectives here are to provide accurate and timely information for you so you can help to make some decisions on some of these difficult topics that are before you from a policy standpoint. We can provide you with good budget information from about 2018 on. There have been some changes in budget systems. So it's a little bit difficult to compare some data, but we do have good personnel information for you in this presentation. So we want to make sure that we can be responsive to your needs as a committee, to your constituents, and also provide open communication and clear understanding of what our college is all about. Next slide, please. So this just gives you an indication of what's happening here with personnel in our college. So we now have a much bigger and more complex organization to run as a College of Agriculture, Life Science, and Natural Resources. So our total faculty numbers with the incorporation of these two new units have increased by 37%. Our total number of employees have gone up 27%. Our undergraduate student numbers are up 77%, and our graduate student numbers up about 57% with the addition of these new units. Next slide, please. So here's a list of our academic programs. These are our undergraduate degree programs in descending order by student numbers. So you can see that our largest program remains animal science. Ag business is also a large program for us. And for family consumer science program has dropped down a little bit. We do have a lot of students now in the college who are majoring either in pre-med based disciplines like physiology, wildlife and fisheries biology, and management in the biology program. We're working too in our college to increase instructional capacity in rangeland fields. As you know, this is something we've been working on over the last couple of years, and we thank you for your support and helping us to get some positions and some resources through match dollars from those programs, and focusing on increasing enrollment and recruitment for programs in all of our fields. Next slide, please. So here are our academic programs. So you can see there's different colors here. So ag and natural resource programs are in purple. Our botany and zoology, physiology colleagues are in this rust color. And then our graduate student numbers are on the top of the list. So we are following a national trend with degrees. We're seeing a decrease in enrollment. This is happening university-wide and also nationwide. Next slide, please. Yes, sir.
Well, we're there. I'm going to forget enrollment in which courses are we losing students on?
We're losing students pretty much across the board. We did have, I'd say, a fairly significant impact on some of our ag programs during COVID because of the lack of experiential learning opportunities. So a number of those students dropped out for a little while. We think there were some family financial issues associated with a lot of those students too. They're starting to come back. So next year, we're seeing an increase in 30 students, and most of those students are in our ag programs. That's from our college. Yeah.
Speaking of the university overall.
University overall is losing enrollment, but that's a nationwide trend. We're seeing fewer high school graduates, and we're also seeing fewer individuals going to college for various reasons. Next slide, please. So, yeah, so we had student numbers, and we also had degrees here. So one of the things that makes our college really unique are the engagement, research, and service that we provide as part of our land grant mission to our state. So these are programs that none of the other colleges at the university have. So we're very fortunate to be able to offer this service, these services to the state. Extension is obviously the most prominent here. We have 25 county-based offices. We have extension educators, 4-H educators in the field, and faculty specialists in a number of disciplines, mostly on campus where they have teaching, research, and extension appointments, but also some of our faculty specialists are also out in the field. We have our Wyoming Agriculture Experiment Station that is comprised of our 4 research and extension centers. One of them is here in Lingle. That's our SAREC Center. And Sheridan, Powell, and then also in Laramie. And these agriculture experiment station and these research centers offer different types of services across the state, depending on the region that they're in. They have slightly different focus areas. We also have our Wyoming State Veterinary Lab. This is a major service operation we provide for the state, for our ranchers and for others as well. We've recently, because of the merger, adopted the Wyoming Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit as part of our college. And then we also have our Wyoming Seed Analysis Lab up in Powell. Next slide, please. So we do have a number of other programs that make us really special in our college as far as experiential learning opportunity for our students. We have a number of judging teams. We have a student farm. We have collaborations with our cattle and wool growing associations across the state, a number of professional networking opportunities for our students in the terms of either professional association at the university and programs like dietetics or in range management and vet science, but we also have clubs then there too, where our students can engage in different activities, both on campus and also in the community. We have student chapters of various professional societies, and we also have fraternities and sororities associated with agriculture, in addition to honorary societies as well. Next slide, please. So here is a little bit of an overview of what's happened to our personnel in the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. So this doesn't include our new units. We're focusing on remaining competitive to the extent that we can in recruiting talent into our university. It has been a difficult couple years recruiting talent, and this has been a nationwide trend at universities as well. We've had some major budget reductions in fiscal year 15, there was a big, or 16, a big cut. And then also around 21, we also had a major cut and lost positions in the college. This isn't something that was unique just to us, but we did have some programs because particularly of the voluntary separation program in 2015, where we lost a lot of talent in certain programs that were very important to our college. The 2023 figures, that's the last column, don't reflect any of the open positions that we currently have out there, and we're in the process of attempting to fill. So right now we have 5 faculty vacancies and then also 8 extension positions that are currently open. So those positions have been allocated to us, and we're in the process of getting those filled. But if you look, though, we'll see from fiscal year 15 to this year, we've gone from 96 faculty to 76. Gone from 130 academic personnel to 100. And then our staff has dropped from about 145 to 132. Next slide, please.
I'd have a
Yes,
question.
sir. Go ahead.
Yes, Mrs.
Mr. Chairman.
Rasko, so the decrease in professionals, is that because you're unable to hire them, or is it because of university cuts or legislative cuts?
Well, we've lost budget dollars. Yeah, so those are actually a reflection of cuts. Yeah. Next slide, please. Oh, here it is. Okay, so this just gives you a table summary of our personal losses and gains. And if you do the math, you'll see that we have a net loss of 26 faculty and a net loss of 20 extension educators. And so this is a direct reflection of budget cuts. Kelly, do you have any comments on that?
Not really, just a reminder that this doesn't account, so these gains and losses don't account appropriated but unfunded positions, of which we have several. So that's not accounted in here. So it's not a complete loss. Some of them, we have the positions, we just haven't filled them for various reasons, but we have the positions, they're in the budget, but we haven't filled them. So
I think that's a total of 14 though.
Yeah.
Yeah, 8 extension and 5 faculty. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so here's some of the good news we've had from our college. Recently, we are making a lot of progress, and a lot of the progress we've been able to make in the last couple of years has been due directly to the support of your committee and from the legislature as well. So we do have the 8.6 million in SEPA funds we're working with to upgrade some of our facilities, particularly in Laramie. We did have a request for 27 million for additional appropriations for maintenance and upgrades for our R&E centers that were not funded in the last budget. From the WIP program, we were able to get a new extension position in Casper. We do have two WIP Phase 2 projects underway. One is to expand our ranch management ag leadership program across the state, working with our community colleges. And a second is to build out plant science and ag tech programs at EWC here. So we're going to be having a lunch right after this to talk a little bit about that program development that we're going to be able to fund through this WIP initiative. The strategic investments in agriculture from the matching funds, the $6.5 million that legislature provided for us has been very instrumental in helping us to launch some new programs and provide some structure and some basis for operating for programs that are important to our constituents across the state. That $1.6 million in recurring funds for our R&E centers to cover inflationary costs have helped us greatly in the last year, as along with the $860,000 that was recently provided for our vet lab for the pathology positions and other positions to not only help with recruitment, but also with competitive salaries and support of the lab that supports a core mission of our university. Student numbers are relatively stable. So we're, as I mentioned, we're up about 30 undergraduates over last year. And we do have a lot of new students coming in from the Arts and Science College and biology related programs. And we're looking for the synergies that we're going to be able to build by bringing these new students and also these new colleagues into our college. Next slide, please. So this is just a revenue and actual expenses that we've had from 2019 until this current year. The 23 numbers are low because these are actuals year-to-date expenditures. So expenses. So we still have incomplete data for the fiscal year because it's not over yet. Where you see the variances are primarily due to COVID years and between about mid-2020 through our 22 fiscal year, where we had positions that were open, but we weren't able to fill them because people were pretty much not moving around. It was very hard to attract talent during that time for a number of reasons and a reduction in operating. Did you have any other comments on that, Kelly? But that's sort of where why those variances are up as high as they are. Next slide, please. And you can see here, this addresses one of the major questions that came up this morning prior to our presentation as to where our revenues come from. So you can see here, this again is just for the Ag and Natural Resources College. It's not with our new partners that came in from ANS last year. So our state appropriation is almost 50% of our total budget for the college. Other grants are primarily federal grants from NIH, USDA, National Science Foundation, contracts from the private sector. You can see here that our federal capacity dollars that are in green are only 6.9% of our total college budget. So it's a big number in the sense it's on the order of millions of dollars, but still it's a small percentage of our total budget. Our foundation dollars, we've been working very hard over the last few years to build up private giving within the college. And that is a total of about 10% of our total funding from foundation. And then other designated would include items such as program fees, farm sales, those sorts of things. So again, the take home there is about 50% of our budget comes directly from the state of Wyoming. And here's a breakdown here. Salaries are the largest bulk of our budget. Salary and fringe about 75%. So this number would be considered to be maybe a little bit low, relative to other university departments, and that's has a lot to do with the fact that we have off-campus facilities that we have to run and manage. So that increases the operating in our college compared to a university program that would be primarily associated with just delivering academic programs. So Kelly.
Do we have any questions before we move on? I think we do have one. Go ahead, Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for clarification's sake here, do we have any mechanical arts programs running currently?
Yeah, Representative, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, Senator Kolb, yes, we do. We have a College of Engineering, obviously. And so those would be where our mechanical arts programs would be. We also have programs that we're building out in ag tech, which would also be something I would consider to be a mechanical art. So a lot of systems and things that we have associated with plant science, irrigation systems, machinery, those types of things would be mechanical arts-based programs. Yes, sir. Kelly, anything there? No. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I guess when you're ready, Mr. Crane.
Okay, thank you. As Barbara hands me the reins, I'm just going to say that we really appreciate this opportunity to be here in front of this committee, because I see I'm really optimistic and excited about the direction our college is going. And I really look at this as an opportunity to work jointly with this committee to advance our college. So it's an exciting time. And I think we've got opportunity to do great things for the university and great things for our college. So I'm glad to be here. Some people think I'm crazy in that, but I'm glad to be here in front of you. So anyway, so I've got a set of slides here. So Katie, thanks for forwarding these for me as we go along. Some of this is going to be a short history lesson. I apologize for that. And many of you understand this system very well, but the land-grant university as a concept gets a lot of publicity and language without a lot of understanding about it. So I'm going to go through this really quickly. I provided you some information in there if you want to read it more. It's a good look at the history of our country, really. So important on the first slide, I just wanted to say that the University of Wyoming is a land-grant institution. It's part of a land-grant system that covers the whole nation, including the Pacific Islands and Alaska and Hawaii and Puerto Rico. They're the colleges that were designated by the state legislatures to receive the benefits of the Morrill Act. There's 3 different Morrill Acts. So there's an original one signed by President Lincoln in 1862, which established the first round of land-grant universities, of which Wyoming is a part. There was another land-grant act, another Morrill Act in 1890, which established land-grant universities at historically Black-serving universities, primarily in the South. And then in 1994, there was another act that established land-grant status to tribal colleges. So Wyoming only has one. We have one 1862 land-grant, and that's the University of Wyoming. But we're part of this nationwide system. So next slide. A little bit about what a land-grant college is. I'll go through these as quick as I can, but I'm not known for brevity. So it's an institution of higher learning which is designated by you in the state legislature to receive the benefits of the Morrill Acts, in our case of 1862. So the Morrill Act granted federal lands for the establishment of a public institution in each state, where the leading object shall be, and I'm quoting this right out of the act, without excluding other scientific and classical studies and including military tactics. The story goes, the Congress from the South would have never let Lincoln pass this law without the inclusion of military tactics, because it was during the Civil War. But to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts in such a manner as the legislatures of the states may respectively prescribe, which is what you were talking about earlier, in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions in life. So a lot of people talk about ag and the mechanic arts, but to me, and this is not my area of scholarship by any stretch of the imagination, but it was really about providing access to higher education to the industrial class, to the blue collar people in this country. That's what the land grant does. And for many of us in the college and in the university, that's a really particular source of pride for us, right? Because certainly many of us, me included, and many of us would never have had access to higher education if it would have been limited to the wealthy elite, which was what it was before the Land Grant Act. It was really following the European model of higher education, which said, if you own land, if you're elite, if you're wealthy, you have access to a university education. So what the Land Grant Act did was take that away and say, no, we're going to provide education for the industrial classes. So anyway, it's a real source of pride for me. So anyway, that's next slide, please. That's the Land Grant Act. So there's a couple other acts that are associated with it. And like Barbara said, it really makes our college unique from other colleges. Mike can throw something at me, but we get nervous when you compare our College of Ag, Life Sciences, and Natural Resources to other colleges, like just other colleges, the College of Business, the College of Law, College of Arts and Sciences, because they don't have the opportunity or the obligation for service that we have, right? So the next two acts are what gives us that obligation. It makes us different. So when you compare student numbers versus faculty and budgets versus faculty compared to other colleges at the university, it's really, you have to be careful because we have all these other things we do. Many of our faculty live in your communities. They don't all live in Laramie. So it makes us different, right? I'm not saying there's an unfair comparison. I just say we're different. We have different obligations and responsibilities. So the first of these acts was the Hatch Act, and my colleague up there, Dr. Webster on the back row, this is where he provides leadership in our college. But the Hatch Act in 1887 established the Ag Experiment Stations. So it provided direct payment of federal funds to each state for the establishment of an experiment station associated with every land grant university. The Hatch Act, what does it says? It says that we should conduct original and other research investigations bearing directly on and contributing to the establishment and maintenance of a permanent and effective agriculture industry. Really clear what the Ag Experiment Station is supposed to do. We still have that at the University of Wyoming. It also is how we have R&E centers, which are in communities across the state, as Barbara mentioned. So generally, Hatch Act funding at the University of Wyoming, we get an annual appropriation of federal dollars. They come straight to our college. They don't come into the block grant. They don't come to Old Main. They come straight into our college. Eric Webster is the PI on a grant. We get that money and it comes to our college. So we get an annual appropriation. It's based on a federal formula. It comes directly from USDA to us. It requires 100% match of state funds. So for every dollar we get in the Hatch Act, we have to match it with state funds. So I'll talk about the exact numbers here in a minute, but it requires 100% match of state funds or they don't give it to us. And it also has some limitations on use. The Act prescribes what we can use these dollars for. Mostly they don't want us hosting parties and making political contributions. But the important one is we can't use these federal dollars to teach classes. Eric can't use Hatch dollars to pay tuition for a graduate student. I can't use Smith Lever dollars to teach classes for college credit. That's the limitation. Primary one. Okay, next slide. So that's the Hatch Act. Then came the Smith Lever Act in 1914, and that established cooperative extension at every land grant university. The Act states that cooperative agricultural extension shall consist of the development of practical applications of research. We're supposed to take the research out to the state, and it says in the areas of agriculture, home economics, and rural energy. Obviously, at 1914, rural energy was important. It's probably still important. Anyway, that's what it says. So it's really the same as the Hatch funding. We get an annual appropriation of Smith Lever funds. They come directly to our college. We match them 100% with money that you appropriate out of our state funds. And then we have a 5-year plan of work that we adhere to. We have to do annual federal reports. Allegedly, we're going to have to start budgeting these dollars every year to tell them before we get the money how we're going to spend it. But same kind of limitations. But the big one being we can't use extension educators can't teach for college credits without another appointment. They do often, but we have to use other monies to support that.
Mr. Chairman, if I may
Senator.
interrupt, Kelly, just a quick question before we get too far off of the Hatch Act and Smith Lever and move on. So when
Your
these-
mic's not on, Larry.
So
Thank
when
you.
these funds come into the university and they're directly going, and then I'm assuming that the block grant automatically just provides a commensurate level without any strings. That goes over to the Ag College to match those federal funds. Internally, what's the process then that you have within the College of Agriculture and Ag Extension to say, what are our priorities? What programs, where are you going to deploy the capital? Is it going to Torrington, to Sheridan? Is it going to be for sugar beet research, or is it forage crops, or is it animal nutrition? What is the process that you guys go through internally once the monies are there to look at deployment of that capital and prioritization of what programs get funded? And is there a role for either? There used to be an advisory type of organization. So can you just walk us through that process?
I think I can. Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks. So you're right about when the money gets there, with the exception of there's no line item within the block or even within the university accounting system that says this money is to match federal funds. We just take it out of our federal appropriation into extension. In our business office at the college level, we just bring in state match. So it's really kind of hands off from a university administrative perspective. As far as how it's deployed, two ways. We have to fill out a 5-year plan of work that we submit to the federal government that really broadly defines. But basically, make sure there's nobody from the Fed here. We try to make Wyoming priorities fit federal initiatives. That's really what we do. Our 5-year plan of work, we have to adhere to some federal initiatives, but really we make that plan of work meet Wyoming's needs, and we make those that 5-year plan of work fit both the federal initiatives as well as the state needs. From there, so that's a 5-year plan of work. That's a federal document. Our internal document is how we really do it is based on a strategic plan for extension and the Ag Experiment Station, which is based on feedback from our educators out in the state, from industry organizations we work with. And you'll see, we don't have a lot of flexibility because most of our budget's tied up in salary. But for the most part, our mission is to respond to local needs. And so we do that by a strategic plan that we develop internally.
So just
Go ahead and follow up.
one follow-up. Who's we?
That would be.
Is that the faculty, or is that just out of the dean's office or your office, or is it strictly with Ag Extension? So when you say we, how broad is that encompass internally within the university?
I'll speak to extension because that's what I know, Mr. Chairman and Senator Hicks. We have, when we develop our 5-year plan of work, we do it as part of an annual meeting of extension. So all the extension educators, we convene in November every year. Part of that annual meeting involves a process where we identify needs and develop a plan, develop that 5-year plan of work, or kind of priorities within that. So that includes the director, associate directors, some of our state association chairs participate in that process, as well as all of our educators out there. So pretty much everybody has a word in there. The bottom line is probably the director, associate directors develop the priorities for the system.
Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kelly, there's probably an opinion from you, is that do any of these federal dollars that we take have any strings attached to them that I would categorize as not Wyoming values as a conservative point of view? Maybe they're trying to put like a woke agenda on it, or do you sense any of that, or has that been, you had to deal with any of that where you picked and choose like how you lay out what your 5-year plan is? Could you maybe help to shed some light on that question? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, I'm glad you characterize this as opinion, because I'm happy to give you that. I really, that has not been my experience with capacity funds, that the sideboards on those funds are not very high. So there's been nothing that says you do this with these dollars or we're not giving them to you. I would think an interesting consideration is that the state dollars we match federal dollars with adhere to the same restrictions. So if we get $1 million of state capacity dollars from the federal government, the state money that we get to match that has to have the same restrictions on it, but they are really not very stringent. So I have not experienced that.
Senator Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How do your advisory groups at the experiment stations fit into this process? Are they more at each individual experiment station advising what crops might be worked on, studied?
Yeah, and Dr. Webster's up there and he could correct me if we need to. He's our director of the Wyoming Ag Experiment Station. My understanding is the individual advisory groups for our R&E centers, that is Sheridan, Powell, Laramie, and Lingle. They really guide the local resource allocation, priorities, crops, and issues. So those are developed at the local level, but I'm sure as they develop a system-wide strategic plan, they consider the input of all of those advisory committees. Likewise, we have a college committee, an advisory committee that helps guide us at the college level, at the dean's level on how we allocate positions and resources, and we take their input periodically also.
Senator Ide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under this Smith-Lever Act, says the act states that, it's for instruction, practical demonstrations of existing and improved practice of technologies in agriculture, home economics, and rural energy. Could you explain the rural energy part of that? I'm not sure what they're referencing there. Thank you.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I'll give it my best shot. You think about when it was passed in 1914, the RREAs, the rural electric co-ops, were really just developing, mostly in the East. The aspiration of this act was that Extension or the universities or the land grant universities would help shepherd that movement west into rural communities. So 1914, many of communities in Wyoming didn't have centralized power and that. And so it was saying the university, you should help get this in. It's not a lot different. I think about broadband and internet connectivity today. It's the same thing. We have many rural communities that don't have access to what the rest of the world has, and maybe our university can play a role in doing that. That's my sense of how it got in the act. Wow.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. I would have one. So we're kind of getting back to Senator Ide's question about federal funding and what it would be like to wean off of that. So it looks like about half of it's federal grant money, and we have to match most of these grants with federal dollars as well. Is that kind of universal in the thing? Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, there's some level of match in almost every federal dollars. Most of our federal grants that aren't Smith-Lever or Hatch monies are not 100 one-to-one match. I think your question will get answered as we get down here and you look at the relative amounts we have. Then I'd be happy to engage in the weaning question.
We'll move on.
Thank you. Okay, so the next slide is just what the capacity funds look like to the University of Wyoming in terms of amounts. So that top group that says Animal Health, Hatch, Multi-State, and McIntyre Stennis, those are little sub pools that all kind of constitute what I would consider Hatch dollars. They're the research dollars that come from the federal government. You can see on that 5-year, 6-year period, they're about $2.5 million or a little less, and pretty stable every year. So that comes to the Wyoming Ag Experiment Station, and that's the revenues that come in there. Down below is Extension. These are Smith-Lever dollars. Smith-Lever B and C, they divvy these up. FNEP is our Expanded Food Nutrition Education Program. RREA, we get a little money for that, but the sum total is about $2 million a year. So pretty equal, little about 2.5 for research and about $2 million a year for extension comes from the federal government.
Representative Craigo.
Dr. Crane, so I just assumed the 2023 is year to date. That's why it's so much lower.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Craigle, correct. These are based on actual expenditures. So yeah, we haven't spent it yet.
We have, Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How are the county dollars represented? Did you require, buy-in from the counties? Where is that on these sheets? Thank you.
Chairman, Senator Culp, I think I'm going to get there. I'll get there. Okay. So I thought and this kind of goes along with Senator Hicks' question. I thought it was important that to put some of this in here, in that the budget realities that have faced us the last 5 years, and before that, actually starting in 2016, has really created a need, maybe an opportunity, but certainly a mandate that we change things. So extension has changed. I mean, this slide just talks about some of our strategic initiatives and how we're doing business today, just to give you an idea of what we're doing. We reconfigured our teams. We had 5 teams at one time of educators, from 5 down to 3. So the 3 teams we now have are 4-H youth development, community vitality and health, and ag and natural resources. We also, during this time frame, transitioned from a area-based model, which said our educators served a 5-county area. We kind of pulled back and said, we want a county-focused program where educators really focus most of their work on the county in which they live. We also want them to travel out if they have areas of expertise to work with neighboring counties, but we pulled back. This was both an effort to make us more efficient, I think to better meet local needs, but also to just address the budget realities that we didn't have enough people to cover the whole state at that kind of scale. Important to us, we're still in this process of implementing a career track for our 4-H youth development educators. And we really wanted to focus extension outcomes on things that would impact Wyoming. So next slide. So we defined some what we called impact areas. Again, we wanted to focus these educational programs extension provides to address challenges that we think every Wyoming community faces. Just to kind of keep our educators and our specialists and researchers focused on things that matter to Wyoming. So these are the areas we identified. They could change, but we want to foster economic vitality in our communities, empower Wyoming's future leaders, protect our natural resources, improve health and wellness, and help people produce food, fiber, and energy. So those are our focus areas. Next slide, unless you got questions. Okay, so this is where we talked about student numbers. In the extension world, we don't keep track of participants very well, except in our 4-H youth development program. So I think it's probably everybody at this panel will recognize that 4-H is our most recognizable, arguably our most important, and probably our most valued and impactful program we have in extension. So, and I think this perspective is apparent if you look at how, at least in the last 5 years, how extension has allocated resources and positions. So 4-H is important to us. Our membership, so that's the membership over a 10-year or a 5-year period from 2018 to 2022. We had almost 8,000 4-H members in 2018-19. Part of that was how we counted members. We changed a little bit. So that drop between 18-19 and the 19 and 20 is probably not a real drop in 4-H participation, but more about how we counted the numbers and a new enrollment system we had. But in general, we average somewhere between 6,000, 6,500 4-H members statewide in Wyoming, and somewhere between 1,500 and 1,000 registered screened adult volunteers. So you can all help increase that number if you want to be a 4-H volunteer in your community. But that's where we're at, about 1,000 volunteers. And that number has dipped a little bit part of that is people are busy. Part of it is our enrollment process and some of the things we put our volunteers through. I see people nodding emphatically on that, but our program doesn't work without volunteers. And I'm sure Megan and every 4-H educator in the state will agree to that. So that's kind of a look at 4-H.
You mentioned how, kind of a sideline, how you changed the way you counted the numbers. Was that done in about 2020 when the numbers dropped from 8,000 to 6,000? That was,
yeah.
Explain how you would count the numbers. I would think that'd be easy to do. And
Yeah,
only
you'd
one
think,
way.
wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I think a part of this was we had, at one time, we had after school, we still have a lot of after school programming that kids that probably, youth that wouldn't be considered as traditionally enrolled in 4-H. And we counted those numbers in that prior system. And so even if they just participated in an after school program, but weren't doing project-based work, we counted them. And so we refined that a little bit, is my understanding, in that year, and that was a dip. Okay, the next one is just kind of, again, the same time period and a trend in how many, this is non-4-H, adult education. No, it does include 4-H, excuse me. But this is how many educational contacts Extension has statewide. There's 2 different reporting periods here. Again, the university changed our reporting system in 2020, so we changed that a little bit. But in general, our direct educational contacts, that's one-on-one, face-to-face educational contacts, as high as 270,000 and down now in 2019, which was COVID, 174,000 direct educational contacts in Wyoming communities. So a kind of a maybe a disturbing trend downward if you include the COVID period there. But truthfully, I think that reflects a diminished workforce and fewer people out in the state. And so anyway, that's my observation. The next graph, the kind of blue and red one, is we changed to make it more consistent with university metrics. So now we're doing the number of programs we teach and how many instructional hours. You can see we're in the neighborhood of 4,000 to 5,000 programs we teach, and we're probably close to 10,000 instructional hours. So that's kind of the outputs from Extension. Next slide, please. All right. So here's our budget. There's this in the next slide present some of the same information, but the next slide's a little more refined. This was developed by our in a galaxy far, far away in our finance department. So if you really pin me down, I'll shovel the questions to Mike or Vicky. This is our budget 2018 to 2022 on a revenue and expense side. So what you see is if you follow that column all the way down in 2018, you see we had a surplus of $1 million. 2019, we had a surplus of 128,000. And then we had some deficits for the next few years. And you can see the non-operating expenses in those years were substantial, especially in the 2020. So the 2020 column, follow it down to the third block, and we're up near $500,000 in non-operating expense. I think a big bulk of that, I think, are the budget cuts that we took in 2021 and part of 2022. So that's probably responsible for the lack of a surplus in our overall budget. We took some big hits. Everybody in the university took hits. Everybody in the state and local community took hits. It was a tough budgetary time. That's just what it was. So I think that's what's reflected in there.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senator, go ahead.
Kelly, and you can hand this one over to Mike if you'd like, but I understand everybody took cuts across the university. I think what one of the questions that we're most interested in was, were those cuts equitable across all the colleges and program, or did ag at a less reduction or a higher reduction than other colleges and other programs, particularly with ag extension? and experiment stations and how that translates. So is that information available, Mike?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I can I'm convinced we can provide something along those lines.
Yeah, I'm
I
really
don't-
interested in parity, and what I want to make sure that is this, because these decisions are made at a much higher level than the three of you sitting here. But if you can get that information, is when we went through these budget cutting processes, was there parity across colleges and programs throughout the university? I think it would be helpful information for the committee to understand what the priorities overall of the university fits in and how that fits into the budgetary reductions associated with that. Gives us a little insight.
Yes, we'll gather that information.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I can say, Mr. Chairman and Senator Hicks, that in the 2022 or 2021 budget cut, extension was explicitly spared from that cut. So again, that was one where it came to from the university that extension would not explicitly named would not be part of that cut. Actually, us, if I remember right, it was us and the state vet lab were spared from that cut. So in that case, I think we came out ahead. The other thing, cuts are usually manifest themselves in lost positions or hiring freezes. The other upside is that on the extension side, we've been spared from centralized position management, meaning that when positions come vacant, they come into Old Main, we call it, into administration, and then they reallocate them. Our extension positions are not part of that. And again, we're really appreciative of the provost and the president for doing this, because when we have field-based extension educators, positions that move on or retire or whatever, for the past 3 years, we've been able to immediately fill those positions, even during a hiring freeze with the rest of the university.
So, Mr. Chairman, just a follow-up on that. As part of that, though, the nature of the federal funding because most of that's going to personnel, or a lot of it, is part of that just that requirement for the federal funds, getting back to, we can't reduce, we have to contribute our 50%, right? And so if in fact that Old Main wanted to do that, we would lose potentially part of that federal funding.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, that might be part of it. My sense is it's more about public engagement in our programs. It's more about we have passionate people in these communities that support our youth programs. And I just think it's a good decision, right? We don't want the political fallout in Goshen County of having an open 4-H educator position and us saying, sorry, we have a hiring freeze. That's not acceptable. So I think that's some of it. You'll see in the budget that that may factor in, but that's not my sense of it. But yeah. Okay, I'll keep going. Sorry, I'm going to run you into lunch, but the next one is a little finer, and this gets at Senator Kolb's question a little bit more. These are our data. These are actual expenditures for the same period of what happened. So if you look down the revenue side, this includes our state revenue, the bulk of which is in salary, of course. But important there, it's got our federal capacity funds, other grants, and then these county approved budget salaries and operating. We get in the neighborhood of $2.5 million out of Wyoming counties through our partnership to fund the salary package for 4-H youth development educators. It's a really important part of our budget. It's actually a really important part of how extension functions. This county partnership, you'll hear me say it again, makes us different, but it's really important. And extension doesn't look like it does in Wyoming without the support of Wyoming counties. So this has that money in there. Some of that money doesn't ever go to UW except the salaries. They get it. But in the first graph that you got, it wasn't in there, but counties provide operating funds for our educators in every county. It's significant. And that doesn't get captured in the university's estimate of what the revenue on the extension side. So this captures some of that. I'll say it doesn't capture it all because in almost every county, counties provide us facilities which have a market value and are worth a lot of money. And so the county contributions to extension are real. And again, it doesn't look like extension if we don't have county partnership. So this captures some of that. Again, if you follow the bottom line, the net result, we're in the black. A negative is not a negative down there. Our accounting people had to explain that to me. But that's not a negative. It scared me to death when I saw it. It's a positive. So that's favorable. So in 2019, we carried over $3 million, which we should probably spend more, right? But again, we're dependent on federal funds. We don't want to stick our neck out and have to let people go or something if we lose these federal dollars or other grants. And a lot of these funds, if you look down our revenue, are things like foundation funds and designated accounts and grants that carry over year to year. So we really don't have a lot of surplus, but we're not in the red, I guess is the punchline.
Senator Colton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And also the counties provide copy machines and office equipment. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Koch, yes. And you'll see on our personnel, they provide personnel, right? In every county, we have support staff, administrative support people that are provided by the counties. And it's in there, our best estimate of it. Okay, next slide. Okay, so our colored donuts, this is relative revenues for extension. So I think it leaves no question regarding who supports UW extension in Wyoming. And that's the state of Wyoming. 46% of our budget comes from the state. And this might get at Senator Ike's question a little bit. The other big chunk is about 24% comes from counties. And that probably doesn't count everything we get from counties. So we're really supported by the state and the counties. Our federal capacity funds are about 12% of our budget. And then we have some other things in there, but that kind of is just on a relative scale, who supports extension. And it's largely the state of Wyoming and our counties. Next one. This is a little bit of how we spend our money. Not surprising. It's up in salaries. I think when I first took in the director role, it was probably in the low to mid 90s. In salaries, but that's come back a little bit, which I think is good. We want people's what make us work and helps impact your communities, but we need some flexibility to support programs. You can't have everything tied up in salaries. Next slide, unless you got questions. This is just, I won't go through all this. This just kind of defines what our partnership with counties looks like. We provide an educator in every county that we pay 100% of the salary and benefits for. And in exchange, we split a 4-H educator that we provide half the salary and all the benefits, and the county pays half the salary in most cases. But then the county provides facilities, operational support, vehicles, copy machines, stapler, anyway, a lot of support. And administrative support person in every county. So that just kind of outlines what counties provide to us. And again, it's exceedingly important. Next slide. This tells who we are in extension. About a third of our position are educators, 28% support people. Those are county positions by and large, paid for by the county. CNP, the 18%, that's a sensible nutrition program. That's for SNAP Ed education, help people learn how to cook and spend their food budgets wisely. That is a grant funded, a federal grant position funded program exclusively, not capacity funds, but a separate grant. And then specialists, the 19% there are mostly on campus, mostly in academic departments that do research to support our educators. They also do a lot of education out in the state. So that's who we are. The next slide is where we're at. About 71% of our personnel are somewhere other than Laramie, out in the state, in communities that you live in, or at R&E centers or places like that. About 30% of us are on campus. The last one, the one you've all been waiting for, is just kind of a summary of personnel in extension for 10 years. So if you look at 4-H youth development educators, we've done a great job of protecting those positions, and we've even maybe gained a couple. I don't think we've actually won in that period. And we gained 4-H positions because counties support them. In a couple of our counties, they pay 100% for a second 4-H educator. So we have gained some 4-H positions, and we certainly haven't lost any. Our community vitality and health and ag natural resource in this 10-year period, you can look, the difference between is we've lost 8 positions in community vitality and health, about 5 positions in ag and natural resources, and a total, we're down about 11 field positions. And we have, right now, I think we have 8 counties without an area educator in them. So that's something that we want to resolve.
Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So these negatives are actually a negative, according to your accounting system here? I'm very confused about the numbers sometimes.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, that's true. And in red.
The other question was, are you still working with the counties when it comes to the extension person that is, split between them and you for the process of selecting a person in that position? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, good question. Thanks for that. The short answer is absolutely. We don't hire people that are based in a county without including a representative from the county commissioner and at least one or other representatives from the public. They're very involved in this. It would be exceedingly rare for us to swim upstream from what the commissioners saw as appropriate on a position. But yeah, they're involved, certainly, in every case that I know of.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Senator Hicks.
We can't let him get off the hook this
Okay.
easy, so.
I figured you'd have something to say.
So-
Go ahead.
So I'm just trying to track some of the funding and getting back to your earlier statements, that the feds have criteria that you have to stay within. I want to focus specifically on Smith Labor. And we can take to the last one where you just showed the reductions. And so reductions in community vitality and health. I'm not exactly sure what that is. So if you can help me with that, but then to tag on to that, when we go to the slide where you showed the Wyoming impact areas for UW Extension, foster economic vitality, empower Wyoming's future leaders, protect natural resources, improve health and wellness. And then I go back to what the original language in the Smith Labor Act is about rural utilities. Really it's getting the technology dissemination out there and home economics. So when I look at this, Kelly, it looks to me to a certain extent, when we get into the impact areas that university, I'd call that mission creep to a certain degree, and maybe I'm wrong, but how does community vitality and health fit into those impact areas? I'm assuming maybe that's health and improved wellness. And how does that tie into home economics? So help me connect the dots from the federal funding with the requirements to the what would you call it? The category there, impact areas that Extension's working on. And then how does that relate to community vitality and health?
Okay, Mr.
Connect the
Chairman,
dots.
Senator Hicks. I guess your mission creep would be my evolving to meet contemporary needs. Extension has changed, undoubtedly. But I do think what guides us is to meet the needs in communities. And so community vitality and health is a bit of a conglomeration between our former nutrition food safety work, which importantly did lots of food safety work, food preservation, eating from the garden, all of those things that food safety involves. And our community development education group, which does board training and leadership development training in almost every county in Wyoming. So that's what community vitality health is to us. It's bringing the university resources to bear to help the economic vitality of communities. No different to me than what rural energy did in 1914. It's a different world. We have a university that has a lot of resources that can help local communities. So I just characterize it as an evolution because things are different in communities than they were in 1914.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I understand that. And I know there's a guy behind you with the Business Council that does community development, economic, and so overlap, competing missions and stuff. And me and you'll have a discussion sometimes because I'm a textualist and an originalist, not an evolutionist. So, but noted. We'll have that discussion over beer sometime.
Any other questions, committee? Yes. Representative Prego.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this question, I guess, could be for either Dr. Crane or Dean Rasko. I mean, the funding levels we have now, both from the state, fed, county, I mean, are we meeting our goals? Is that money the appropriate amount? Is it enough? Is it too much? Is it allowing us to do what we want to do now and over the next 10 or 20 years? I mean, how does that look going forward?
You could take a stab at it now.
Okay, you tell me where I'm wrong. My perspective is, I think our capacity is showing the effects of some long-term cuts. And the reality is even our federal dollars, we all know from our household budgets that an even budget, you lose 7% a year. You know, even funding isn't even, it's going down. So I think our capacity has been impacted by that. That's what I'll say. The other thing is my observation is that we're one deep in terms of faculty, and I characterize it as being, in some cases, on the ragged edge of being able to teach our undergraduate programs in important areas, important to me, I'll say. All education areas are important to somebody, but in animal science, in range management, in plant forage production, plant protection and production, we're one deep in faculty positions there. And I worry about that. And I think some of our student numbers might reflect that. So I guess the answer is, I think we're showing some of that. And I think we could benefit. We are. So I'll say it. The draft bill that went out was really encouraging to me from the last session, because Barbara and Michael, throw something at me. We need recurring funds that will support our faculty to teach the programs we need and to do the research that addresses Wyoming's problems. There's always room for efficiency and to change how we distribute money, but we need people to do that. And we're just dying a death from 1,000 cuts in this diminished budget. So some of it we need to refocus. Granted, there's always room for that, but I worry about some of our programs that are really critical to the state of Wyoming in terms of support.
Senator Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to go back to, you had a comment on the community vitality and health portion there. I thought I heard something about board training. And are we talking about like our local board, like our fire districts and our conservation districts and all that? I think that's vital. And can you explain what is happening on that? Because our boards do need trained.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mr. Chairman, Senator Larson. Thanks for the question. It's really one of the showcase programs of our community development educators, where they do local training for boards, how to function on a board, encourage participation in local boards, especially important in small communities, and how to work on a board, anyway. Not that people need this kind of, but it really helps. People need training on how to do this. It's not something we do. I need that training. But that program has been delivered with new commissioners coming in. I know in Park County, Tara Kuipers, one of our former educators, delivered this nearly statewide for new commissioners. And really every volunteer board in many communities, we've done that. Our numbers we're down to 2.5, I'd say, a community development educators statewide. Our capacity to deliver that program is seriously limited right now. But it was a great program. I appreciate you bringing it up.
John? Yeah, Senator Cole?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to, I guess, help me out with understanding things that I'm gonna sound pretty ignorant here. So you have unfilled staff positions, right? The question I have is, what do you do with the funds that were allocated for those staff positions? When you don't have folks there, are they spent on other things? How does that work? Thank you.
Barbara, you may have to help me on this. We try to carry those over until we fill the positions. In the past, we've used those to support startup packages or recruitment for other positions or things like that. But we try to carry those over until we fill the positions. But salary savings have been a part of our budgeting process for as long as I can remember at the University of Wyoming. So they do get reallocated, but never at the expense of that position, is my experience.
Well, but continuing on with that, you talked of positions that you're really short on and you have concerns about where we're going. And in just the way it works, our budget process in Wyoming, we pay cash for everything that we use, and we live or die by the income we get out of minerals predominantly. And it'll affect everything, not just the university, but every agency we've got. If those positions then aren't filled that you've talked of, does that money is it used in extension to continue to balance your own budget, or are you still trying to hire those people?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we just keep at it. We just keep trying to hire them. And it is really challenging. I mean, that's part of it. I think you look at personnel numbers and people assume that those positions are gone, and we're having a hard time filling positions out in the state. Some of it is, nobody likes to hear this, but some of it's our compensation package. We're not market competitive. Some of it's the cost of living. When we send somebody to live in Buffalo or Pinedale or heaven forbid Jackson, people can't live in these communities on what we pay them, is the reality. And so it's hard to fill positions. And that's all of my regional peers have the same challenge. And frankly, the private sector has the same challenge. We're having a hard time filling positions. And it's not because we don't have them budgeted. It's because we can't find the right people that want the job in some of these communities we serve.
Mr. Chairman. Great lead in. Great lead in, Kelly. So you've identified the problem as lack of qualified people in it, right? Have the institutional background in the education. When I look at our trend within the ag college of being flat and enrollment or slightly trending down, we have every sector. Agriculture cannot find labor, can't find skilled help, whether you're manufacturing equipment and needed a computer technician down here at the implement dealer to the agronomist out in the field, nutritionist across the board. So what is the strategic plan to utilize all the resources that the university has in conjunction with our ag research stations and our community colleges to start to reverse this trend? Number one, it starts with, if you well indicated, our 4-H educators, which then get into our high school FFA programs that they should translate into our community colleges and funnel these people into a 4-year degree program at the University of Wyoming. Do we have an integrated plan to start reversing this trend of loss of people within these colleges and expertise Because it's really the Achilles heel for agriculture, right? Every industry sector. What is, and I guess I would ask this of you, Dean, because it's really a more appropriate question for you, is as to where are we headed with this, and do we have a strategic plan, and what's that look like from a standpoint of financial resources and personnel? Because until you provide us that information, we can't help you.
Well, Mr. Chairman and Senator Hicks, it's a difficult question. We do have a strategic plan. It's focused on building two areas, and across the college, we're focused on ag and natural resources and community and vitality and health. And then last year we picked up these other units. So we're looking at, needs specifically in things like pre-health professions and wildlife. Those are two areas that we're bringing into the college now. Where we're stuck is with overall resources. So we've done some consolidation within our programs across the college. We're looking at curriculum efficiencies. We're looking at ways so we're not duplicating efforts across units. But basically what's hurting us is that we've lost positions, and every position we fill today is costing us tens of thousands of dollars more than it did last year. So we're looking at salaries now, thanks to the raises we were able to get over the last 2 years from the legislature. We're able to target both some compression issues we've had at the university, and we're able to reward some of our meritorious people, and we have across the board raises. So we're currently working on that right now. We got some good news. I sent the message out to everybody here where we had some serious compression with some of our faculty leaders and our college department heads, where we've been able to get those salaries adjusted up. So a lot of our issues with salaries, a lot of it is with having open positions we can't fill because they're not competitive. And a lot of it is with lost positions where we're, like Kelly was saying, we're just sort of on the knife's edge. So we're trying to focus on some areas we think are really critical to the state. Agriculture production and ranch management was one area that we focused a lot of attention on the last couple of years. So we're sort of using that as an example to build up something that's core to the nature and character of agriculture in the state that makes Wyoming a little bit different than other places. So that's where we've put a lot of resources. But the trouble is we don't have a lot of resources. We just don't have what we need to really be as strong as we'd like to be all across the board.
Mr. Chairman, just a real follow-up. I think you've identified a bottleneck, but we haven't addressed the problem. And so put it in today's terminology, we have a supply chain problem. We can't address your issue until we start to get the supply chain up and running. And when we see enrollment increase by 10 or 20 or 30%, those other resources will start to flow to the college. So we've got to get the supply chain issue, which is students enrolled in your program at the university. Otherwise, we're just static. It's pretty hard to go make an argument to the legislature when you see other colleges that are significantly increasing the student enrollment to say that we need to continue to increase the budget for the college until. So in my mind, in today's connotation of this world, is we have a supply chain issue, and that's getting kids into agriculture and getting them flow in there. And this is where I think you're going to have to come back with a very integrated strategic plan that starts with 4-H, goes to FFA, utilizes our research centers, our community colleges to start to build that supply chain. Because until that starts to improve, we're going to be in very tough budgetary times on a static program. And we can do all the efficiency we can by bringing in other colleges. And I have some grave concerns with that because I think that's going to dilute I think that's going to have more of a diluting effect than an additive effect in the long term without increased enrollments in those specific agricultural programs at the University of Wyoming. So it's a challenge I throw out back to you across the board, from ag extension, community colleges, ag experiment station. We better start working on the supply chain issue here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To you, Kelly, I think. How many unfulfilled positions do you have average a year?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cole, 7. I think we have 9 open right now in various stages of open, but on the streets, I'd say annually, we probably turn over, this is probably not counting our youth development educators. We probably annually turn over 4 to 5. Right now, we're at more like 7 to 9.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess this isn't really a question. It might be in response to Senator Hicks' comments. Really, I think we're talking a little bit about chicken and the egg sort of process here. I mean, I think the idea is if we're able to grow some of these programs, change some of these programs, we can maybe attract the students that we want to attract. I mean, that's how I think about the problem right now. And I don't think we can throw it all on the entire problem on the university extension 4-H. I mean, agriculture, getting kids involved in agriculture, wanting to go into that, it's a hard endeavor. Typically, it's not an occupation that pays the same as a lot of our other jobs. You can work a lot less hours and make a lot more money doing something else outside of agriculture. You have to do it because you love it. I'm just speaking from experience. That's why I have a law degree, so I can afford to go to the ranch when I want to. And so it's difficult, but I think the idea is we got to modernize what we're doing at the university. That's going to take money. It also takes a plan. This is where I do agree with the good senator is I think we need a plan. I mean, what's that plan look like? How would the expenditure of additional monies make the changes that he's wanting, that I'm wanting, the direction we want to see the university? I agree with that. Before we expend any additional monies, we need to know, okay, here's the plan. Here's the programs we're going to grow. Here's how they will grow. And here's how that money will make the difference. And that's where I agree with him. I don't know. I disagree with that. It's probably falls on you to get those kids there. I think that falls on us as a state, as how are we going to get kids to the university to study agriculture, whatever those programs might be. And I think there's ways to do it. It's just, we got to work together and figure that out and develop a plan. And that might take some time. I mean, that might not happen right away, but I think it's doable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And not questions for you, just comments and maybe a little add to your workload. So when we see that comparison of monetary analysis across the colleges, I'd like to also see enrollment, and I'd like it to be for at least last 10 years and make it non-confusing so that your consolidation, it's split out as the way it used to be and the way it's going to be now so that we can look at comparison there. I would agree that I don't think this is all on extension or the College of Ag. I think it's a much broader discussion as where is our university headed and what are we emphasizing at our university? And is it agriculture and engineering, or is it other things that have taken hold there? And are those cultures clashing? Because I see a culture clash of kids that are raised in our rural communities that would like to continue on in a college education setting. And yet there's a culture clash that they don't want to contend with anymore. Quite frankly, they're avoiding. And I know that from talking to some of them that have been through it. And so we're going to have to address the culture of our university at some point. And it's right before lunch and we're not going to do it today. But I guarantee you we will in the future, and we'll have to continue discussions we've had in the past. And I've got a good call into our President Seidel to have a discussion with him as well. And so I'll leave it at that for today. Thank you.
Representative Allemand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is kind of a follow-up to Senator Steinmetz. I've been sitting here thinking, how do I say what I want to say and not be rude and crude? I've heard from several many constituents that said they will not let their children go to the University of Wyoming because it is woke, because it's gotten a very black eye over the last year or so. Boys living in girls' dorms, drag shows. We got a problem with that, folks, and I cannot have I cannot explain to my people, go ahead, send them, they'll be all right, because they don't think they will. Thank you.
Bill, we've had co-ed dorms for 50 years. I was in one when I was at the university. So that's been going on. Yeah, I know. I think I know where you're going, but all right, I think we're done with questions. Thank you very much. We'll continue
Mr.
the
Chairman,
con-
with your indulgence, right before lunch,
betcha.
I just,
Go ahead.
I'm going to drop these invitations off with LSO, but Pepper Joe wanted to make sure I emphasize that this college will be hosting a Wyoming Under the Stars August 1st in Sheridan at the Research and Extension Center. It's a way to learn about a lot of the great research and extension programs going out around the state. And so hope many of you can join us in Sheridan in August. So thank you.
So, and we're going to be coming to the university the end of October and touring the college and the lab and some other things there. You know, every time we do this, it's kind of a bleak picture. We keep making cuts, and it seems like less and less funding and less effective educating that might go on. But I guess I would hope that the college has some plans with less money to become one of the top tier ag colleges. I don't think it was long ago that we were, and we're every state in the country has a land grant university. They're all competing for the same funds, but I would hope that you might have some input when we get there to discuss how to improve it, not dwell too much on the
Mr.
what's
Chairman,
going on. Yeah, go ahead.
can I just
Larry.
try to encapsulate something, based on some of the last comments is what I see is we have had significant budget cuts at the university, but typically when any organization goes through a budget cutting process, they go back through a reprioritization of what's a priority program that requires the dedication of those fundings. And so I think what you're hearing from this committee is when those tough decisions have been made, we're not necessarily comfortable with the reprioritization of expenditures as to how that's being deployed at the university. And that gets to some of the social issues I think my colleagues were talking about. So I don't think there's anybody here that doesn't want a world-class agricultural college. But it's disconcerting sometimes that when we have these budget reductions and we look and see what's happening to our beloved College of Agriculture and Engineering and stuff, and yet other programs and colleges are stood up at the same time. That's a priority reallocation of resources, finite resources that the university administration has made that doesn't sit well, I think, with a lot of rural Wyoming. And so I don't know how to encapsulate it any better, but I think that's the takeaway from this last conversation.
Thank you, Senator. Are you finished?
Yes, sir.
Good. Well, good. No, it's fine. We're still in pretty good shape, but we'll take public comment as well if there is any. Okay, committee, we are adjourned for lunch till what time is it now? What? Oh, we still have more.
Just the joint committee, right outside the doors here, will be lunch. Lunch will be served just outside the doors. And you're more than welcome to eat in the commons area, come back in here. Our cafeteria, we don't want you to trudge all the way to the other side of campus. But we can serve right out here and you have space out in the commons or just back in here just to grab lunch. But our caterers just waiting out.
Thank you.
Yeah, and committee, we're gonna reconvene at 1:30. Just get back on schedule. Thank you.